Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The descent at mile marker 127. From Marcus Chen, the interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the pale glow of my headlights, and the familiar hum of my Peterbilt's engine had become a lullaby after 16 hours on the road. I was hauling refrigerated produce from Sacramento to Denver, a route I'd driven countless times over my 12 years as an owner-operator. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 in the morning, and my logbook told me I had maybe 30 minutes left before I'd need to find a place to rest. The Nevada desert rolled past my windows in endless waves of sage and shadow, punctuated only by the occasional reflective mile marker catching my headlights like cat eyes in the darkness. That's when I saw the exit sign for Millbrook, glowing green in my high beams at mile marker 127. I'd driven this stretch of Interstate 80 more times than I could count, and I knew every truck stop, every rest area, every way station between California and Colorado. There was no Millbrook exit at mile marker 127. There never had been. But there it was, as real as the steering wheel in my hands, with a smaller sign beneath it promising fuel, food, and lodging. My CB radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. Even the truckers who usually chattered through the night had gone silent. The exit ramp curved away from the highway in a gentle arc, illuminated by sodium lights that cast everything in an amber glow. My fuel gauge showed I had plenty of diesel to reach my planned stop in Elko, but something about that sign nagged at me. Maybe it was the way the letters seemed slightly too bright, or how the reflective surface caught my headlights with an almost liquid shimmer. I found myself easing off the accelerator, my truck's Jake brake engaging with its familiar rumble as I considered whether to investigate this unexpected option. A gust of wind rocked my trailer slightly, and I noticed that the desert around the exit looked different somehow. The vegetation was lusher, darker, as if this pocket of land existed in its own microclimate. The air coming through my vents carried a strange sweetness, like flowers blooming in the middle of winter. Against my better judgment, I signaled right and began the slow process of guiding my 40-foot trailer toward the mysterious exit. The ramp felt solid beneath my 18 wheels, the familiar vibration of asphalt transmitting through the cab as it always did. But as I descended, I noticed something peculiar about the way my headlights played across the road surface. The asphalt seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, except the October night was cool enough that I could see my breath when I'd stepped out at my last fuel stop. The ripples moved in patterns that didn't quite make sense, flowing against the natural grade of the ramp in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. My truck's suspension groaned softly as we descended, though the sound seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick around us. The fuel, food, and lodging promised by the sign materialized ahead of me in the form of a small truck stop that looked like it had been transplanted from the 1970s. Neon signs advertised coffee and diesel in cursive script that flickered and buzzed in the desert air. A single other truck sat in the parking area, its running lights creating pools of red and orange against the building's weathered concrete walls. But what struck me most was how the entire complex seemed to sit in a depression, as if the earth had formed a shallow bowl to hold it. The optical illusion made everything appear to be slowly sinking into the desert floor. I guided my rig into a parking space and set the air brakes with their familiar hiss. The silence that followed felt absolute, as if my engine's shutdown had somehow muted the entire world. Even the ever-present whisper of desert wind had stilled. I climbed down from my cab, my boots hitting pavement that felt strangely soft, almost spongy, though it looked normal enough under the mercury vapor lights. The air carried that same sweet scent I'd noticed earlier, but now it was stronger, almost cloying, with an underlying note of something I couldn't quite identify. The truck stop's glass doors were heavy and opened with a pneumatic wheeze that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the harsh white glow that every trucker knows intimately. The coffee station gurgled and hissed in one corner, and a few aisles of snacks and road supplies stretched toward a counter where a clerk sat reading a paperback novel. Everything looked normal, mundane even, except for the way the floor seemed to tilt slightly, as if the entire building was listing to one side like a ship taking on water. The clerk looked up as I approached, and I noticed his name tag read Earl in friendly red letters. He was maybe 60, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the desert, but his eyes held a strange brightness that made me think of deep water reflecting starlight. He smiled and asked if I needed anything, his voice carrying a slight echo despite the low ceiling and carpeted floor. I requested a cup of coffee and mentioned how I'd never noticed this exit before, trying to keep my tone casual and conversational. Earl's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too white in the fluorescent glare. He explained that Millbrook was a newer stop, built to serve drivers who needed a break between the bigger truck stops. His words made sense, but something about the way he spoke bothered me, as if he was reciting lines from a script he'd memorized long ago. The coffee he poured looked normal enough, but when I lifted the cup, the liquid inside seemed to move independently of my gestures, swirling in patterns that had nothing to do with the motion of the cup itself. I sipped the coffee and immediately regretted it. The taste was wrong, bitter in ways that had nothing to do with overbrewing or cheap beans. It carried that same sweetness I'd been smelling, but concentrated and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in standing water. I set the cup down and noticed that the liquid had left a residue on my lips that tingled strangely, almost numbing. Earl watched me with those two bright eyes, his smile never wavering, and I began to feel like a specimen under observation. The feeling of being watched intensified as I browsed the store, pretending to look for snacks while trying to process what felt wrong about this place. The aisles seemed longer than they should have been given the building's apparent size from outside. The merchandise was familiar brands, but with slightly incorrect labels, as if someone had tried to recreate a truck stop from memory and gotten the details just wrong enough to be unsettling. A bag of chips proclaimed itself to be Lay's Original Flavor Chips instead of just Lay's, and a candy bar wrapper advertised Snickers brand peanut and caramel bar in hard fonts that were almost but not quite right. More disturbing was the way the floor continued to feel unstable beneath my feet. Each step produced a sensation like walking on a waterbed, as if the building's foundation was slowly giving way to some immense pressure from below. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dim and brighten in rhythm with my heartbeat, and the ever-present hum of electrical equipment took on an organic quality, like the breathing of some vast sleeping creature. I made my way to the restroom, hoping to splash some water on my face and clear my head, but the hallway leading to it seemed to stretch longer with each step I took. The walls were painted in that institutional beige common to truck stops everywhere, but the paint appeared to move slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it, rippling like the surface of a pond disturbed by an unseen hand. The restroom door, when I finally reached it, bore a sign that read Facilities instead of the usual pictogram, and the words seemed to shift and blur when I stared at it too long. Inside, the fluorescent light flickered erratically, casting shifting shadows that made my reflection in the mirror appear fragmented and strange. The water from the tap ran normally enough, but when I cupped it in my hands to splash my face, it felt thick and oily, leaving a film on my skin that wouldn't wipe away completely. The mirror showed my face clearly enough, but the background reflection revealed a restroom that looked subtly different from the one I stood in, as if I was seeing an overlapping version of the same space from another angle or another time. When I returned to the main area of the store, Earl was still behind the counter, but now he stood perfectly motionless, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind me. His breathing had stopped and his chest remained perfectly still in a way that no living person could maintain. The paperback novel lay open on the counter, but the pages were blank white, empty of any text or images. The fractured gaze. From Marcus Chen, the first time I noticed something wrong with my rearview mirror, I was hauling a load of electronics through the Nevada desert at 3 in the morning. My Freightliner Cascadia had been my home away from home for 8 years, and I knew every rattle, every hum, every quirk of her aging systems. The mirror had always been reliable, showing me exactly what I needed to see. The endless ribbon of highway stretching behind me, lit by my trailer's red taillights like a pathway to nowhere. But that night, somewhere between Reno and Vegas, the reflection began to stutter. It started subtly, the way most unsettling things do. I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror and glanced up, expecting to see another truck approaching from behind. Instead, I saw my own face staring back at me from an impossible angle, as if the mirror had briefly turned inward rather than showing the road. The image lasted only a fraction of a second before snapping back to normal, displaying the empty highway bathed in amber light from the occasional street lamp. I rubbed my eyes and blamed the caffeine withdrawal. I'd been cutting back on coffee at the suggestion of my doctor, and the headaches had been making me see things that weren't there. At least that's what I told myself as I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and tried to focus on the hypnotic rhythm of the white lines disappearing beneath my hood. The radio crackled with late-night chatter from other drivers, their voices mixing with the steady drone of my engine and the whisper of wind against the cab. Channel 19 was alive with reports of construction delays and way station closures, the usual symphony of the night shift. I reached for the mic to report clear roads ahead when I caught another glimpse in the mirror that made my hand freeze halfway to the radio. My reflection was there again, but wrong somehow. The face in the mirror wore an expression I wasn't making, a slight smile that felt alien on features I'd seen in bathroom mirrors for 43 years. The eyes were mine, but they seemed to be looking at something I couldn't see, focused on a point somewhere beyond my left shoulder. I turned to check the sleeper berth behind me, but found only darkness and the familiar outline of my bunk. When I looked back at the mirror, everything was normal again. Just the road. Just the night, just the gentle glow of a distant town shimmering like a mirage on the horizon. I convinced myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on me. 3 days of back-to-back runs had left me running on fumes and determination, pushing the legal limits of my driving hours because the delivery bonus was too good to pass up. My wife Sarah had warned me about taking on too much, her voice echoing in my memory as I promised to be more careful, to get proper rest, to remember that no paycheck was worth my safety. The mirror remained well behaved for the next 100 miles, reflecting nothing more unusual than the occasional passing vehicle and the star-scattered sky above the desert. I began to relax, letting the familiar monotony of long-haul driving settle into my bones like an old, comfortable coat. The cab was warm despite the October chill outside, and the heater's gentle hum mixed with the engine's rumble to create a cocoon of sound that usually helped me stay alert during the lonely hours before dawn. But somewhere around 4:30 in the morning, with Las Vegas still 2 hours away, and the desert stretching endlessly in all directions, the mirror began to glitch in earnest. This time the wrong reflection lasted longer. I watched in growing unease as my mirror self turned its head slowly to the right, as if examining something in the passenger seat of the cab. The movement was deliberate, curious, completely independent of what I was actually doing. My real head remained facing forward, eyes on the road, but the reflection seemed to have developed a mind of its own. I reached up and tilted the mirror slightly, hoping to break whatever optical illusion was causing the distortion. The adjustment seemed to help for a moment, showing me nothing but the proper view of my trailer and the empty road behind it. But as I settled back into my seat, movement caught my eye again. The reflection was climbing into the passenger seat. I knew this was impossible. I was alone in the cab, had been alone since leaving the truck stop in Reno, and yet the mirror showed a clear image of myself sitting in both the driver's seat and the passenger seat simultaneously. The passenger seat version of me was wearing the same flannel shirt, the same worn baseball cap, but its posture was different, relaxed, almost casual. It sat with one arm draped over the back of the seat, as if settling in for a long conversation. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind suggested that the mirror's mounting had loosened, creating some kind of double reflection. Trucks vibrated constantly, and it wouldn't be the first time a mirror had shifted position during a long haul. But the explanation felt hollow even as I grasped for it, because the reflection in the passenger seat was moving independently, turning to look directly at the driver's seat version of me with an expression of mild amusement. I forced myself to look away from the mirror and focus on the road ahead. The highway stretched through a particularly desolate stretch of desert, with no other traffic visible in either direction. The nearest town was still an hour away, and my CB radio had gone quiet as other drivers presumably caught a few hours of sleep at truck stops and rest areas. The isolation that usually comforted me during night drives now felt oppressive, as if the darkness itself was pressing against the windows of my cab. When I couldn't resist looking back at the mirror, both reflections were staring directly at me. The one in the driver's seat wore my face but not my expression. Its eyes held a calculating intelligence that made my skin crawl, as if something else was looking out from behind features that should have been familiar. The passenger seat reflection maintained its casual pose, but now it was smiling broadly, showing teeth that seemed too white in the mirror's dim reflection. I pulled over to the shoulder with more force than necessary, gravel crunching under my tires as I brought the rig to a stop. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I reached up to examine the mirror more closely. Under the dome light's harsh fluorescent glow, everything looked normal. The mirror was properly mounted, clean, showing exactly what it should show. The interior of my cab, empty except for me, and the slice of highway visible through the rear window. I climbed out of the cab and walked around to inspect the mirror from outside, looking for any sign of damage or distortion that might explain the hallucinations. The desert air was cold against my face, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of dawn still hours away. Everything about the mirror appeared normal, reflecting the trailer's running lights and the empty road behind us with perfect clarity. Back in the cab, I tried to convince myself that fatigue had finally caught up with me. I'd heard other drivers talk about the strange things they'd seen during particularly long hauls. Phantom vehicles that disappeared when approached, figures walking along empty highways, faces and windows that shouldn't have faces. The mind played tricks when pushed beyond its limits, creating phantoms from shadow and expectation. But as I merged back onto the highway and gradually brought the truck up to cruising speed, the mirror began its impossible display once more. This time there were 3 of me reflected in its surface: driver, passenger, and a third figure that seemed to be standing in the sleeper berth, leaning forward with its hands on the back of both front seats. All 3 reflections moved independently, creating a silent pantomime that I couldn't look away from despite my growing terror. The standing reflection appeared to be speaking, its mouth moving in animated conversation with the other 2 versions of myself. They nodded and gestured as if engaged in a heated discussion, occasionally pointing toward the windshield or glancing at instruments on the dashboard. It was like watching a meeting of strangers who all happened to share my face, planning something that filled me with instinctive dread. I tried adjusting the mirror again, covering it with my hand, even switching off the dome light to plunge the cab into darkness. Nothing helped. The reflections continued their mysterious conference, occasionally pausing to look at the real me with expressions ranging from pity to amusement to something that might have been hunger. The worst moment came when the driver's seat reflection suddenly looked up and met my eyes directly. Its mouth moved in a clear, deliberate pattern, and though I couldn't hear any sound over the engine noise, I could read the words it was mouthing. "Pull over. Let us out." That's when I floored the accelerator and drove straight through the night without stopping, ignoring rest requirements and speed limits, focused only on reaching Las Vegas and the safety of bright lights and other people. The reflections grew more agitated as I drove, gesturing frantically and appearing to argue among themselves. Sometimes one would seem to reach toward the mirror's surface as if trying to push through the glass. The Rebellion of Rubber and Steel, from Marcus Chen. The thing about driving an 18-wheeler for 23 years is that you develop an intimate relationship with every component of your rig. You know the particular growl your engine makes when it needs oil, the way your steering wheel vibrates just slightly to the left when you're carrying an unbalanced load, and most importantly, you know exactly how your tires grip the asphalt beneath 40 tons of rolling steel. That's why what happened on Interstate 80 outside of Winnemucca, Nevada, still keeps me checking my mirrors more often than I should. Even now, 6 months later. It was one of those crystalline desert nights where the stars seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, and the temperature had dropped enough to make the cab comfortable without running the air conditioning. I was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver, making good time on a route I'd traveled hundreds of times before. My Peterbilt 379 was humming along at a steady 70 miles per hour, the familiar vibration of the road traveling up through the seat and into my bones like a mechanical lullaby. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, but for the most part it was just me, the highway, and the endless expanse of Nevada desert stretching out in all directions. I remember checking my watch and seeing it was just past 2 in the morning when I first noticed something felt different. It wasn't anything dramatic or sudden, just a subtle change in the way the truck was handling. The steering felt slightly more responsive than usual, as if the tires were gripping the road with unusual enthusiasm. At first, I attributed it to the cooler night air increasing tire pressure, a common enough occurrence that any experienced driver learns to expect. But as the miles rolled by, the sensation grew more pronounced. The truck began to feel almost eager beneath me, like a horse that knows it's heading home to the stable. The engine's rhythm remained steady, but there was something in the way we took the gentle curves of the highway that made me sit up straighter in my seat. Instead of the predictable drift that required constant minor steering corrections, the truck seemed to be following the road with a precision that was both impressive and unsettling. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, but I realized with growing unease that I wasn't really steering at all. I tried a small experiment, loosening my grip on the wheel entirely for just a moment. The truck continued straight and true, following the highway's center line with mathematical precision. When a slight curve appeared ahead, the wheel turned smoothly in my hands without any input from me, guiding us through the turn with the kind of fluid grace you'd expect from a sports car, not a fully loaded semi-truck. The sensation sent a chill up my spine that had nothing to do with the desert night air. Deciding to test this phenomenon more deliberately, I approached the next curve with my hands barely touching the steering wheel. Sure enough, the wheel began to turn on its own, rotating smoothly beneath my palms as if guided by invisible hands. The truck leaned into the curve with perfect timing, the trailer following behind in a smooth arc that would have made any driving instructor proud. But I wasn't doing any of it. The truck was driving itself, and more disturbing still, it was doing a better job than I was. My heart began to beat faster as I considered the implications. In all my years of driving, I'd heard plenty of stories from other truckers about strange occurrences on the lonely highways. Tales of phantom hitchhikers, mysterious lights in the desert, and trucks that seemed to develop personalities of their own. I'd always dismissed these stories as the products of sleep-deprived minds and too much caffeine. But now I was living one of those stories myself. I decided to take more decisive action. Gripping the steering wheel firmly, I attempted to make a slight correction to the left just to see what would happen. The wheel resisted my input with a gentle but unmistakable pressure, as if the truck disagreed with my chosen direction. I pushed harder and the resistance increased proportionally. It wasn't violent or jerky, just a steady, patient force that seemed to be politely declining my suggestion. When I released the pressure, the wheel smoothly returned to its chosen position, keeping us perfectly centered in our lane. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, and I grabbed for it eagerly. desperate for human contact. "Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose. Anybody out there?" came a woman's voice, clear and strong despite the late hour. I keyed the mic with trembling fingers. "Desert Rose, this is Mountain Man. I'm eastbound on 80 near mile marker 173. You wouldn't believe what I'm dealing with out here." I tried to keep my voice steady. Professional. "Go ahead, Mountain Man. What's your 20 and your trouble?" I hesitated, knowing how crazy it would sound. "Desert Rose, this is going to sound strange, but my truck seems to be driving itself. The steering wheel is turning without any input from me, and it's following the road perfectly. I can't seem to override it." There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her voice had changed subtly, becoming more cautious. "Mountain Man, when did this start happening?" "About 20 minutes ago. Everything else seems normal. Engine, transmission, all my gauges are reading fine. It's just the steering that's acting up." I glanced at my mirrors and noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dim red glow of my taillights, I could see the truck's massive tires. They appeared to be rotating with an odd, hypnotic rhythm that didn't quite match our speed. The treads seemed to be moving in slow, deliberate patterns that reminded me somehow of breathing. "Mountain Man, I need you to listen to me carefully." Desert Rose's voice came back, now carrying an urgency that hadn't been there before. "Do not, under any circumstances, try to force the truck to stop suddenly. Do you understand me? Whatever you do, don't fight it aggressively." "What do you know about this?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Has this happened before?" "Just trust me on this, Mountain Man. Let it take you where it wants to go, and when it's ready, it'll give you back control. Fighting it will only make things worse." Before I could respond, the CB went silent except for static. I tried calling back to Desert Rose but got no response. I was alone again, but now I was armed with the terrifying knowledge that whatever was happening to me had happened before, and someone out there knew about it. The truck continued its supernatural navigation for another 40 miles, handling every curve and hill with unnatural precision. I found myself becoming almost hypnotized by the smoothness of the ride, the way the steering wheel would move with gentle, deliberate motions that seemed almost alive. The dashboard lights cast everything in a soft green glow, and the endless ribbon of highway stretching out in my headlights began to take on a dreamlike quality. It was approaching 3:30 in the morning when I saw the exit ramp ahead. Interstate 80 continued straight, but there was a small off-ramp leading to what my map indicated was nothing more than a maintenance road for the highway department. To my amazement and growing fear, I felt the truck beginning to slow down. The engine's pitch dropped as we decelerated, and the steering wheel began turning toward the exit. No, I muttered, gripping the wheel and trying to steer back toward the main highway. "We're not getting off here. We're staying on 80. But the truck had other ideas. Despite my best efforts, we drifted smoothly onto the exit ramp and began climbing up toward the overpass. I pumped the brakes, but while the truck slowed, it didn't stop. We rolled up the ramp and onto a narrow 2-lane road that led away from the highway and into the absolute darkness of the desert. For about 10 minutes, we drove along this unmarked road, my headlights cutting through the blackness and illuminating nothing but scrub brush and empty sand. Then, as suddenly as the strange behavior had begun, I felt the steering wheel loosen under my hands. The truck's eager responsiveness faded away, replaced by the familiar, predictable feel of normal mechanical steering. I was back in control. I immediately brought the truck to a stop, my hands shaking as I engaged the parking brake. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and my own rapid breathing. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but there was nothing visible in any direction except the faint glow of Interstate 80's lights several miles behind me. It took me nearly an hour to find a place wide enough to turn the big rig around, and another 20 minutes to navigate back to the highway. When I finally merged back onto Interstate 80, everything seemed normal again. The truck responded to my steering inputs exactly as it should. The tires gripped the road with their usual predictable traction, and the familiar rhythm of long-haul driving resumed. The last frame. From Marcus Chen, the dash cam was supposed to give me peace of mind, not steal what little sleep I had left. I'd been driving long haul for 17 years, crossing the endless ribbons of asphalt that connect the forgotten corners of America, and I thought I'd seen everything the road had to offer. The device sat mounted just below my rearview mirror in my Peterbilt 379, a small black rectangle with a single red recording light that blinked steadily like a mechanical heartbeat. My insurance company had recommended it after a string of fraudulent claims against truckers, and the monthly discount made the investment worthwhile. What I didn't expect was for it to start recording things that hadn't happened yet. The first incident occurred on a foggy Tuesday night somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno. The California Central Valley stretched endlessly on both sides of Highway 99, invisible in the thick marine layer that had rolled in from the coast. My headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead, and the yellow dividing lines appeared and disappeared like dashes of paint in the gray void. The engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby, and the rhythmic thump of my tires over expansion joints had nearly lulled me into that dangerous highway hypnosis when I decided to pull into a rest stop for coffee and a 15-minute power nap. The Chevron station materialized from the fog like something from another dimension, its fluorescent lights creating pale halos in the mist. I parked at the fuel island and went inside for a cup of their burnt coffee and a stale sandwich, chatting briefly with the night clerk about the weather and road conditions ahead. Nothing remarkable happened during the stop, just the usual routine of a veteran driver taking care of business. I was back on the road within 20 minutes, the dashcam faithfully recording my departure as I merged back onto the highway. 3 days later, while reviewing footage to verify my logbook entries, I discovered something that made my hands shake as I held the tablet. The timestamp showed my departure from the Chevron station at 2:47 a.m., but the recording continued for an additional 18 minutes past when I knew I had left. In this extra footage, my truck sat motionless at the fuel pump while emergency vehicles surrounded the station. Red and blue lights painted the fog in shifting colors, and paramedics wheeled a covered gurney from the convenience store to a waiting ambulance. The night clerk I had spoken with was nowhere to be seen, and in his place stood a different person entirely. A thin woman with hollow eyes who kept glancing nervously toward where my truck should have been. I called the station the next day, my voice casual as I asked about any incidents that might have occurred that Tuesday night. The manager told me everything had been quiet, no problems whatsoever, and that Jerry, their regular night clerk, had worked his usual shift without incident. When I described the thin woman I'd seen in the footage, the manager went silent for a long moment before telling me that their previous night clerk, a woman named Sarah, had died of a heart attack behind the counter 6 months ago. They'd replaced her with Jerry after finding her body during the morning shift change. The second recording came 2 weeks later on a rain-soaked stretch of Interstate 80 through Nebraska. The storm had been building all evening, starting as a light drizzle near Grand Island and intensifying into a proper deluge by the time I reached the long, empty miles between York and Lincoln. My wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and the road ahead became a river of reflected taillights and shifting shadows. The usual truck stop radio chatter had gone quiet, leaving only the sound of rain hammering my cab roof and the steady whoosh of water beneath my tires. I pulled into a small truck stop called Danny's Diesel and Dreams, one of those family-owned places that still served homemade pie and charged reasonable prices for a shower. The parking lot was nearly empty except for 2 other rigs and a handful of cars clustered near the main building. Through the rain-streaked windows of the diner, I could see drivers hunched over coffee cups waiting for the storm to pass. I decided to join them, securing my load and making a dash for the entrance through the driving rain. Inside, the warmth and bright lights felt like salvation after hours of fighting the storm. I ordered coffee and apple pie from a waitress named Dolores, who had kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. She told me the pie was fresh from that afternoon and asked about my route, the sort of small talk that made these stops feel almost like home. I spent about an hour there, watching the rain and listening to truckers share stories about weather they'd driven through and loads they'd delivered to impossible places. When I reviewed the dash cam footage 3 days later, I found those same extra minutes that shouldn't have existed. The timestamp showed me leaving Danny's at 11:23 p.m., but the recording continued until 11:44 p.m. During those 21 additional minutes, I watched my truck sitting in the parking lot while the building behind it burned. Orange flames licked through the windows I had looked out of, and fire trucks surrounded the structure while firefighters dragged hoses through the mud and rain. The other trucks in the lot were gone, as if their drivers had fled in panic, and the entire scene played out in complete silence except for the sound of rain on my windshield. I called Danny's the following morning, and Dolores herself answered the phone. Her voice was bright and cheerful as she confirmed that Tuesday night had been quiet, just a handful of drivers waiting out the storm. When I asked about any fire damage or recent incidents, she laughed and told me the building had been standing strong for 42 years, without so much as a kitchen grease fire. But something in her voice changed when I mentioned the specific time frame from my recording. She grew quiet and finally admitted that her husband Danny had died in a fire at their previous location 20 years ago, and that she still sometimes dreamed about flames consuming everything they'd worked to build. The pattern continued over the following months, with each stop generating those impossible extra minutes of footage. A truck stop in Montana showed a 3-car pileup in the parking lot that had never happened. A rest area in Wyoming recorded a missing child search that involved helicopters and bloodhounds, though the facility manager insisted no such incident had occurred. Each recording showed death or tragedy in places where I'd experienced only routine stops and normal interactions. I began to research the locations, digging through old newspaper archives and accident reports. What I discovered chilled me more than any ghost story or urban legend I'd heard during late-night conversations in truck stop parking lots. Every tragedy I'd recorded had actually happened, but not recently. The 3-car pileup in Montana had occurred 15 years ago, killing a family of 5 during a blizzard. The missing child in Wyoming had vanished 12 years ago, and his body was eventually found in the hills behind the rest area. Sarah, the clerk I'd seen in the Chevron footage, had indeed died exactly as I'd witnessed, but months before my visit. The dash cam wasn't just recording death, I realized. It was recording the echoes of death, the psychic imprints left behind when life ended violently or suddenly. Somehow the device was acting as a bridge between past and present, capturing events that continued to play out in locations where tragedy had already occurred. I considered throwing the camera away, but a morbid fascination kept me reviewing each new recording, documenting patterns and researching the stories behind each ghostly replay. Then came the recording that changed everything, the one that made me question whether the camera was simply showing me the past or something far more disturbing. I was parked at a truck stop outside of Amarillo, Texas, a sprawling complex of fuel islands and restaurants that catered to the steady stream of traffic moving along Interstate 40. The night was clear and warm, with desert stars visible despite the glow of commercial lighting. I'd stopped for fuel and a meal, planning to push through to Oklahoma City before taking my mandatory rest break. The recording showed the usual extra minutes, but this time the events were happening in the future. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. when I watched my own truck explode at the fuel pump, sending flames high into the Texas sky. Emergency vehicles surrounded the scene within minutes, and paramedics loaded a body bag into an ambulance while investigators examined the charred remains of my Peterbilt. The scene was too clear, too detailed to be anything but real, and the timestamp was still 6 hours away. I'm writing this from a motel room 70 miles from that truck stop, with my rig parked outside and the dash cam sitting on the table beside my laptop. The clock on the wall reads 2:43 a.m., and I have 34 minutes to decide whether to trust what I've seen or dismiss it as some kind of technical malfunction. The camera's red recording light continues to blink steadily, that mechanical heartbeat that has documented so much tragedy and death. I keep wondering if the device has finally shown me my own echo, the imprint of an event that hasn't happened yet, but somehow already exists in the strange space between past and future, where all endings eventually come to rest. The Countdown Station, from Marcus Rivera. The rain drummed against my Kenworth's windshield in a steady rhythm that night, somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno on Highway 99. It was past midnight, and the interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under my headlights, empty except for the occasional pair of taillights disappearing into the darkness. I'd been driving for 12 hours straight, pushing through to make my delivery deadline when the radio started acting up again. The classic rock station I'd been listening to dissolved into static, then silence before picking up something new entirely. At first, I thought it was just another late-night DJ doing one of those quirky themed shows that fill the dead air between midnight and dawn. The voice was warm and pleasant, almost grandfatherly, with that practiced smoothness of someone who'd been behind a microphone for decades. "Good evening, night travelers," he said, his words floating through my cab like honey. "You're listening to WBTH, where every day is someone's special day. Tonight we're celebrating some very unique birthdays with our dedicated listeners." I adjusted the volume and settled back into my seat, grateful for the company. The wipers swept rhythmically across the windshield, and my engine hummed its familiar tune beneath the dashboard light's soft glow. The DJ continued his introduction with an almost hypnotic cadence that seemed perfectly suited to the lonely hours before dawn. "We have some wonderful celebrations to share with you folks out there on the road. Let's start with a very special birthday girl, Sarah Chen from Modesto. Today, Sarah is celebrating her 34th birthday." Something about the way he said it made me pause, though I couldn't immediately place what felt odd. The words seemed normal enough, but there was an underlying current I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the late hour playing tricks on my mind. Or perhaps the isolation of the dark highway was making me hypersensitive to every sound. I shook my head and focused on the road ahead, where my headlights carved through the persistent drizzle that had started falling an hour earlier. "Sarah called in earlier to tell us about her wonderful day," the DJ continued, his voice maintaining that same warm, measured tone. "She spent it with her family at the park, playing with her children just like she did when she turned 35 last year. Such beautiful memories to share with our listeners." I felt a small frown crease my forehead. 35 last year, but 34 this year? I must have misheard something in the static. Late-night radio often cut in and out along this stretch of highway, with signals bouncing off the mountains in strange ways. The program continued with a gentle musical interlude, some soft instrumental piece that seemed to echo the rhythm of my windshield wipers. When the DJ returned, his voice carried the same comforting warmth like an old friend sharing stories by a fireplace. "Our next birthday celebration comes from Tom Brennan up in Sacramento. Tom is having a wonderful 37th birthday today, and he wanted to share with our listeners how grateful he is for this special time. He told us he's been looking forward to turning 36 next year, when he plans to take that vacation he's been dreaming about." This time I caught it clearly, and a chill ran down my spine despite the cab's warmth. 37th today, 36th next year. That wasn't how birthdays worked. I reached for the radio dial, thinking perhaps I could find a clearer signal or a different station entirely, but something made me hesitate. The wrongness of what I was hearing was so profound that I found myself morbidly curious about where this bizarre programming might lead. Tom also mentioned, the DJ continued in his maddeningly pleasant voice, that he's been feeling so much more energetic lately, so much stronger than when he turned 38 2 years ago. He's been reconnecting with old friends, remembering things he thought he'd forgotten. Isn't that wonderful, folks? Sometimes the years can give us back what we thought we'd lost forever. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to process what I was hearing. The rain seemed to be falling harder now, and I had to increase the wiper speed to maintain visibility. The highway remained eerily empty, as if I were the only person traveling through this strange pocket of the night where impossible radio shows broadcast birthday celebrations that defied the natural order of time. Now, we have a very special call coming in, the DJ announced, and I could hear the faint sound of a telephone connection being established. Hello there, caller. I understand you're celebrating a birthday tonight? A woman's voice came through the speakers, tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. It sounded almost like relief, but there was something deeper underneath, something that might have been fear or desperate hope. Yes, she said, her words slightly distorted by what seemed like a poor connection. I'm turning 28 today. Wonderful. The DJ responded with obvious enthusiasm. And how was 29 for you last year? Tell our listeners about your special day. 29 was... The woman paused, and I could hear something like a sob catch in her throat. 29 was when everything started going wrong. When the diagnosis came, when the treatments began. But today, turning 28, I feel like I did before all of that. Like I have hope again. The implications of what I was hearing began to sink in with a weight that made my chest feel tight. These weren't just backwards birthdays being celebrated on some surreal late-night radio show. These were people who seemed to be experiencing their lives in reverse, moving backwards through years, potentially undoing the worst moments of their existence. The woman on the phone was literally aging backwards, returning to a time before illness had entered her world. That's beautiful, the DJ said, his voice carrying an almost paternal warmth. And what are you looking forward to when you turn 27 next year? I'll be healthy again, she whispered, and now I was certain she was crying. Completely healthy. I remember being 27. I was so strong then, so full of life. I didn't know what was coming. I thought I had forever. You do have forever, dear, the DJ replied gently, just in a different direction than most people expect. Thank you for sharing your special day with us. The line disconnected with a soft click, leaving only the DJ's voice and the strange ambient music that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I glanced at my dashboard clock and felt another chill when I realized that over an hour had passed since I'd first tuned into this station, though it felt like only minutes had gone by. The rain was starting to let up, but the darkness outside seemed deeper somehow, as if the world beyond my headlights had become less substantial. We have time for one more birthday celebration tonight, the DJ announced. This one is very special, folks, because our birthday celebrant is right there with us on the lonely highway. Marcus Rivera, driving his Kenworth through the California night. This one's for you. My blood turned to ice water in my veins, and I nearly swerved into the center divider before regaining control of the truck. The DJ knew my name, knew what I was driving, knew exactly where I was. I looked around frantically at the empty highway, searching for any sign of how someone could be watching me. But there was nothing but darkness and the faint glow of distant city lights on the horizon. Marcus is celebrating a very significant birthday tonight, the DJ continued, his voice now seeming to come from inside my own head rather than through the radio speakers. He's turning 31, and he's remembering what it felt like before that terrible night 8 years ago when everything changed. Before the accident that wasn't really his fault but has haunted him ever since. Before the guilt that's been eating away at him year after year. I wanted to turn off the radio. Wanted to pull over and flee from whatever impossible thing was happening to me. But my hand seemed frozen on the steering wheel. The memory the DJ mentioned came flooding back with perfect agonizing clarity. The intersection. The other car running the red light. The family inside. The investigation that cleared me of any wrongdoing but could never clear the images from my mind or the weight from my conscience. At 31, Marcus, the voice continued. You still had hope. You still believed that the nightmares would fade, that you could build a good life despite what happened. And you know what, Marcus? You were right. As you continue your journey backwards through the years, you'll find that hope again. You'll remember what it felt like to sleep peacefully, to look forward to tomorrow instead of dreading the memories it might bring. The speedometer showed I was still maintaining highway speed, but looking out at the road I could see it was changing. The pavement looked newer, the signage slightly different, as if I were driving not just through space but through time itself. In the distance I could see the lights of a truck stop I remembered from years past, one that had been torn down and rebuilt since then. The fog knows where you live. From Marcus Chin. The CB radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. as I guided my Peterbilt through the winding mountain passes of northern Oregon. The familiar hum of the diesel engine providing a steady rhythm beneath the gentle patter of mist against my windshield. Breaker 19, this is Moondog to any eastbound drivers on I-84. You got your ears on? The voice belonged to Jerry, a veteran hauler I'd known for 15 years of running these same routes between Portland and Boise. His usual cheerful drawl carried an edge tonight that made me reach for the handset. This is Night Owl, Jerry. I'm about 20 miles behind you through the gorge, I responded, adjusting my grip on the steering wheel as the fog began to thicken around the curves ahead. What's your 20 and what's got you spooked? The windshield wipers swept lazily across the glass, clearing away droplets that seemed to form faster than they should in what had started as a clear October night. Through the amber glow of my running lights, I could see tendrils of mist beginning to creep down from the forested hills on either side of the highway. Jerry's voice came back thin and uncertain. Marcus, you ever hear fog that sounds like it's trying to talk to you? I mean, really talk. Not just wind through the trees or nothing like that. I could hear the tension in his breathing, the way his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I'm pulled over at mile marker 73, and I swear on my mother's grave, this fog is whispering things. Personal things, things it shouldn't know. The transmission cut to static, leaving me alone with the steadily building wall of gray that was beginning to swallow the road ahead. I'd been driving truck for 22 years, hauling everything from lumber to electronics across the Pacific Northwest, and I'd seen my share of strange weather. Mountain fog could roll in fast and thick, turning familiar highways into alien landscapes where you couldn't see your own hood ornament. But Jerry wasn't the type to spook easily. He'd driven through blizzards in the Rockies and dust storms in Nevada without so much as raising his voice. Whatever had him rattled at mile marker 73 was serious enough to make me slow down and flip on my four-way flashers. The fog thickened with each passing mile, transforming from wisps to walls of gray that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. My headlights, usually powerful enough to cut through anything nature could throw at them, barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. The familiar landmarks along this stretch of highway disappeared one by one. The old Burma shave signs, the eagle's nest perched on the dead pine, the rusted guardrail where Tommy Hendricks had jackknifed his rig 3 winters back. Everything vanished into a world of shifting gray that seemed to press against my cab, like something alive and curious. That's when I first heard it. A sound that wasn't quite wind and wasn't quite voices, threading through the steady rumble of my engine like smoke through still air. At first I thought it might be my radio picking up some distant signal, maybe truckers on a different channel bleeding through. But when I turned the volume down, the sound remained, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Soft whispers that rose and fell with the movement of the fog itself. Words that stayed just at the edge of understanding, like conversations in the next room that you can't quite make out. I downshifted and reduced my speed to barely 30 miles per hour, watching the yellow center line disappear and reappear beneath the swirling gray. The whispers grew clearer, more distinct, and I felt the first cold touch of real fear when I realized they weren't random sounds carried on the wind. They were speaking English, fragments of sentences that seemed to be searching for something, testing different combinations of words like someone fumbling through a phone book, names and numbers and addresses scattered through the mist like paper scraps blown from an overturned mailbox. Sarah Martinez, 12 on 47 Elm Street. The words drifted past my driver's side window clear as day, spoken in a voice that sounded like autumn leaves rustling against pavement. David Thompson, 892 Pine Avenue, apartment 3B. Another voice from somewhere near my passenger door, this one carrying the whisper-soft quality of morning frost melting on grass. I gripped the wheel tighter and tried to convince myself it was just the fog playing tricks with distant radio transmissions. Maybe some emergency broadcast system test that was bouncing off the mountains in strange ways. But the whispers kept coming, growing more frequent and more personal with each passing mile. Phone numbers recited in sing-song voices that seemed to emanate from the fog itself. Social security numbers spoken with the cadence of children's nursery rhymes. Credit card numbers that appeared and vanished like breath on a cold window. And through it all, that searching quality, as if the fog was a living thing trying to match faces to names, addresses to occupants, voices to the people who belonged to them. Mile marker 73 appeared through the gloom like a ghost sign, and I could make out Jerry's familiar red Kenworth pulled onto the shoulder, his hazard lights blinking orange warnings into the swirling gray. I eased my rig behind his and reached for the CB handset. But before I could key the microphone, the whispers suddenly focused and sharpened, converging on my cab from all directions with laser-like precision. Marcus Chen, the fog whispered, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Marcus Andrew Chen, born September 15, 1971. The voice was soft and intimate, like a lover's whisper against my ear, but it carried the cold dampness of grave soil and morning mist. 1429 Cedar Grove Lane, apartment 12, Vancouver, Washington, 3. Each word of my address fell from the fog with perfect clarity, spoken by a voice that knew me better than I knew myself. I sat frozen in my driver's seat, engine idling as the fog pressed against my windows like curious fingers exploring the glass. Through the CB speaker came Jerry's voice, tight with fear. "Marcus, you copy? It knows where I live, brother. It knows my wife's maiden name and my kids' birthdays and the exact amount of my last mortgage payment. Whatever this thing is, it's been going through our mail." The whispers multiplied around my truck. Dozens of voices now, maybe hundreds, all speaking personal information about people I'd never met. Bank balances and medical records, family secrets and social media passwords. Everything that makes up the private digital footprint of modern life flowing past my ears like water through a broken dam. But threaded through all of it, growing stronger and more insistent, were the details of my own life being recited back to me by voices that had no business knowing them. Credit score 742. Renewed driver's license expires June 2025. Mother's maiden name Patterson. The fog swirled closer to my windshield, and I could swear I saw shapes forming in the gray, faces that appeared and dissolved before I could focus on them. Bank account ending in 7394. Current balance as of yesterday, $3,247.12. Automatic payment to Portland General Electric scheduled for tomorrow morning. I tried to start moving, to get away from whatever intelligence was speaking from the mist, but the fog seemed to anticipate my movements. It flowed ahead of my truck like a living thing, always staying just thick enough to prevent me from seeing more than a few feet in any direction. The whispers followed me, adding new details to their recitation with each passing moment, painting a complete picture of my life that was more accurate than anything in my own wallet. Lives alone since divorce finalized 18 months ago. Sees daughter Emma every other weekend. Currently 3 payments behind on truck note due to medical expenses from father's cancer treatment last spring. The words hit me like physical blows, each one a violation of privacy so complete and invasive that I felt naked and exposed in my own cab. This wasn't information that could be overheard or intercepted from radio transmissions. This was data that existed only in secure databases and private conversations, details that required deliberate intrusion to obtain. Through my side mirror, I watched Jerry's truck begin moving, his taillights disappearing into the fog ahead of me like red stars being swallowed by gray space. His voice crackled through the CB one last time. "I'm making a run for it, Marcus. This fog, it's not natural. It knows too much. It wants something. Then static took his transmission, leaving me alone with the whispers that were growing more urgent and demanding with each passing second. Daily route between Portland and Boise. Usually stops at Milepost Diner for coffee and pie. Prefers cherry when available. Tips exactly 15%. Pays cash. Truck number JK4429. DOT inspection due in 6 weeks. Minor violation for worn wiper blades noted on last safety check. The weight of giants. From Marcus Delacroix. The first time I noticed the hairline crack spreading beneath the lead truck's tires, I thought it was just another case of overloaded freight meeting poorly maintained asphalt. Highway 307 through the Louisiana Bayou country had never been known for its structural integrity, and the humid August night seemed to make everything a little softer, a little more willing to give way under pressure. But as I adjusted my rearview mirror and watched the convoy of 18 identical black Peterbilts stretching behind me like a mechanical serpent, each one following the exact same path, each one leaving those same strange fractures in the pavement, I began to understand that what I was witnessing defied any reasonable explanation. My CB radio had been silent for the past 3 hours, ever since we'd passed through the last truck stop in Thibodaux. The dispatcher's final transmission had been simple enough. Route instructions to deliver our cargo to a facility outside New Orleans before dawn. But something about the way his voice had crackled through the static, something about the way he'd repeated the delivery address 3 times, as if the numbers themselves were an incantation, had left me with an uneasiness that settled in my bones like the humidity that clung to everything in this part of Louisiana. The convoy had assembled at midnight sharp in the parking lot of a warehouse whose windows were painted black and whose loading docks bore no company markings. 19 of us in total, each driving identical rigs that gleamed under the sodium lights with a finish that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The bills of lading we'd been handed were minimal, listing only weight specifications that made my eyebrows raise. 40,000 pounds per trailer, far more than what regulations typically allowed, though the paperwork bore official seals that satisfied the weigh station computers we'd passed through. None of the other drivers had spoken during the loading process. They'd moved with a synchronized precision that reminded me of military operations, backing their trailers up to the loading bays in perfect formation, while crews of workers in unmarked coveralls transferred cargo containers that hummed with a low, almost subsonic frequency that I felt more than heard. When I'd tried to catch the eye of the driver in the rig next to mine, a weather-beaten man with arms covered in tattoos that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering warehouse lights, he'd looked through me as if I were made of glass. Now, 4 hours into our journey, the weight of whatever we were hauling had begun to manifest in ways that challenged everything I thought I knew about physics and the limitations of interstate infrastructure. The asphalt beneath our convoy didn't just crack, it spider-webbed outward from our tire paths in patterns that reminded me of frost forming on windows. Except these fractures glowed with a faint phosphorescence that lingered for several seconds after we passed. More disturbing still was the way the road surface seemed to ripple slightly ahead of each truck, as if the pavement itself was trying to get out of the way of our approach. The bayou stretched endlessly on either side of the highway, dark water reflecting the occasional flicker of heat lightning that illuminated the Spanish moss hanging from ancient cypress trees like funeral shrouds. The air conditioning in my cab had been struggling against the oppressive humidity, but now I noticed that the temperature gauge was reading far lower than it should have been, as if the cargo in my trailer was actively cooling the air around it. When I pressed my palm against the sleeper compartment wall that separated me from the trailer, the metal felt cold enough to leave a slight sting against my skin. Mile marker 247 passed in my peripheral vision, and I realized that we'd been maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour for the entire journey, without any of the natural variations that occur in normal convoy driving. No one had slowed for curves. No one had pulled ahead or fallen behind, and when I glanced at my speedometer, the needle held perfectly steady as if locked in place. My engine's RPM gauge showed the same unwavering consistency, the diesel motor running with a smooth hum that had synchronized with the 18 trucks behind me to create a harmonic resonance that seemed to penetrate the ground itself. The CB radio crackled suddenly, startling me from my observations. The voice that emerged from the speaker was the same dispatcher who'd briefed us at the warehouse, but there was something different about it now, something that suggested vast distances and empty spaces despite the clarity of the transmission. "Convoy leader to all units," the voice said, each word measured and deliberate. "Maintain current speed and formation. Deviation from prescribed route will result in contract termination." I keyed my microphone to acknowledge, but before I could speak, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The road ahead was beginning to show signs of severe structural damage. Not just the hairline cracks we'd been leaving behind, but deep fissures that split the asphalt from shoulder to shoulder. The damage formed a clear path extending beyond my headlight range, perfectly aligned with our travel lane, as if previous convoys had passed this way and left their mark on the infrastructure. "Dispatch, this is convoy leader," I transmitted, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've got some significant road damage ahead. Might want to consider an alternate route." The response came immediately, but the voice that answered wasn't quite the same as the dispatcher's. It carried the same cadence and inflection, but underneath lurked harmonics that suggested multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. "Maintain current speed and formation. The road will accommodate your passage." As we approached the damaged section, I watched in fascination and growing horror as the deep cracks in the asphalt began to close themselves, the fractured pavement flowing back together like water healing around a stone. The surface smoothed itself just yards ahead of my front bumper, creating a path of perfectly intact roadway that extended exactly the width of our convoy formation. Behind us, through my mirrors, I could see the road surface cracking again as soon as the last truck passed, the asphalt buckling upward into ridges and valleys as if the earth itself was trying to expel some foreign presence. The cargo in my trailer had begun to emit sounds that defied easy description. Not quite mechanical humming, not quite organic breathing, but something that combined elements of both into a rhythm that matched my heartbeat so precisely that I wondered if it was influencing my cardiovascular system or merely responding to it. The temperature in my cab continued to drop despite the summer heat outside, and when I exhaled, I could see the faint ghost of my breath in the air-conditioned atmosphere. We crested a small hill, and the landscape ahead revealed something that made me question whether I was still traveling through familiar Louisiana territory. The highway stretched arrow-straight toward the horizon, but the bayou country had been replaced by terrain that seemed to exist in a state of geological flux. The ground on either side of the road rippled and shifted like a slow-motion ocean, while structures that might have been trees or might have been something else entirely swayed in patterns that had nothing to do with wind currents. The CB radio crackled again, this time with a transmission that seemed to come from directly behind me. "Unit 19 to convoy leader," came a voice that sounded exactly like my own, speaking words I hadn't uttered. "Road conditions are optimal. Estimated arrival in 47 minutes. I spun around to look through the rear window of my sleeper compartment, trying to get a better view of the truck that should have been bringing up the rear of our convoy. What I saw in the distance made my grip tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. There wasn't a 19th truck following us. There never had been. The convoy stretched behind me in perfect formation, 18 identical Peterbilts maintaining their precise spacing and speed. But the transmission had come from empty air. "Dispatch," I called into my microphone, abandoning any pretense of calm. "I need immediate clarification on convoy composition. My count shows 18 units plus my own rig, but I'm receiving transmissions from Unit 19. The silence that followed stretched long enough for us to pass 2 more mile markers. When the response finally came, it carried an undertone of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "Unit 19 is designated as navigator," the voice said. "Unit 19 sees the way forward." My headlights suddenly illuminated a road sign that shouldn't have existed. its reflective surface showing a destination that wasn't on any map I'd ever studied. The distance indicated was impossible, suggesting that we'd been traveling far longer and far further than the 4 hours registered on my trip odometer. But more disturbing than the impossible mileage was the way the sign's reflective coating seemed to show not just our convoy, but additional trucks extending beyond the visible horizon, as if we were part of something much larger than 19 rigs carrying mysterious cargo through the Louisiana night. The pavement ahead began to glow with that same phosphorescent light we'd been leaving in our wake, creating a runway of illuminated asphalt that stretched toward coordinates I was beginning to suspect existed somewhere outside the normal boundaries of geography: the broken signal. From Marcus, the horn on my Peterbilt had been stuttering for 3 weeks before I finally understood what it was trying to tell me. At first I figured it was just another mechanical hiccup in my 20-year-old rig, the kind of quirk you learn to live with when you're running cross-country hauls on a shoestring budget. Every truck develops its own personality after enough miles, and mine had always been a temperamental beast with a habit of making strange noises at the worst possible moments. The stuttering started on a foggy Tuesday morning outside of Bakersfield, California. I was pulling into a truck stop for fuel and coffee when I tapped the horn to warn a four-wheeler who'd drifted too close to my trailer. Instead of the usual deep, authoritative blast, what came out was a broken, halting sound that seemed to catch in its own throat. 3 short bursts, then silence, then 2 more, then a long one that faded into nothing like a dying breath. I didn't think much of it that first day. Horns fail all the time, airlines get kinked, compressors lose pressure. But as I continued my run eastbound through the desert, the stuttering followed a pattern that began to gnaw at the edges of my awareness. Always the same sequence: 3 short, pause, 2 short, pause, 1 long fading note. It happened every time I touched the horn button without fail, regardless of how lightly or firmly I pressed it. By the time I reached Albuquerque, the pattern had embedded itself in my mind like a song you can't shake. I found myself humming it during my mandatory rest breaks, tapping it out with my fingers on the steering wheel as I drove through the endless stretch of interstate that cuts through New Mexico like a scar across sun-bleached bone. The desert landscape seemed to mirror the broken rhythm, with its scattered cacti and weathered rock formations appearing in clusters that matched the horn's stuttering cadence. The worst part was that other drivers had started to notice. At truck stops, I'd catch them glancing over with puzzled expressions when I'd honk at backing rigs or announce my departure. Some would shake their heads and walk away. Others would stare a moment too long before continuing about their business. One grizzled driver with arms like tree trunks approached me at a Flying J outside of Amarillo and asked if I was trying to send some kind of message with my horn. When I explained it was just malfunctioning, he gave me a look that suggested he didn't believe me and muttered something about respecting the dead before walking away. I should have gotten it fixed right then. Should have pulled into any of the dozen repair shops I passed between Texas and Oklahoma. But deadlines waited for no one, and my dispatcher had made it clear that this particular load needed to reach its destination in Atlanta without delays. The freight was time-sensitive medical equipment, the kind of cargo that makes you feel important even when you're dead tired and running on truck stop coffee and determination. It was somewhere in Arkansas, during a late-night push through rolling hills shrouded in autumn mist, that I first heard the answering call. I'd been fighting to stay alert for hours, using the horn periodically to test my reflexes and break the hypnotic monotony of highway lines disappearing under my headlights. Each time I pressed the button, the familiar stuttering pattern would echo across the empty landscape. 3 short, 2 short, 1 long fade, then, drifting through my slightly open window along with the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke, came a response. Faint at first, almost lost beneath the steady rumble of my diesel engine, but unmistakably there. The same pattern played back note for note, but with a hollow quality that made the hair on my arms stand up, despite the warm air flowing through the cab. I told myself it was an echo, some trick of acoustics bouncing off the hills and trees that lined the highway. But echoes fade quickly, and the sound seemed to hang in the air with deliberate persistence before finally dissolving into the night. I pressed the horn again, more firmly this time, and listened with every fiber of my attention focused on the darkness beyond my headlight beams. The answer came again, closer now, matching my broken horn's rhythm with eerie precision. 3 short, 2 short, 1 long fade, but there was something else woven into the sound, a quality that spoke of vast distances and empty spaces, as if the response were traveling through places where no roads existed. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I scanned the mirrors and the road ahead, looking for any sign of another truck that might be playing some elaborate prank. The highway stretched empty in both directions, with only the occasional pair of taillights far ahead, and the steady glow of my own running lights reflected in the guardrails. Whatever was answering my horn's stuttering call, it wasn't visible on the conventional spectrum of reality. Mile after mile, the exchange continued. Each time I tested my horn, the response would come from a slightly different direction, sometimes seeming to drift from the pine forests that crowded close to the roadway, other times appearing to originate from the misty valleys that opened up between hills. The pattern never varied, never faltered, as if whatever was out there had been waiting years for someone to finally speak its language. The temperature in my cab began to drop, despite the heater running at full capacity. My breath started forming small clouds that dissipated quickly against the windshield, and I could feel an odd pressure building in my ears, similar to what happens during altitude changes, but more intense. The digital clock on my dashboard flickered occasionally, showing times that couldn't possibly be correct, jumping backward and forward in erratic leaps that made no sense. Then I saw the lights. Not headlights or road flares or anything that belonged to the familiar world of interstate commerce, but pale bluish points of illumination that seemed to float between the trees like oversized fireflies. They moved with purpose, keeping pace with my truck as it wound through the Arkansas hills, appearing and disappearing behind stands of timber, but always managing to stay within sight. I pressed the horn again, more out of nervous habit than conscious decision, and the lights responded by clustering more tightly together, forming patterns that matched the stuttering rhythm. 3 bright pulses, a pause, 2 more pulses, another pause, then a single sustained glow that gradually faded to nothing. The synchronization was perfect, unnaturally so, as if the lights in my malfunctioning horn were parts of some larger mechanism that I'd accidentally activated. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My horn wasn't malfunctioning at all. It was translating something, converting some signal that existed beyond normal perception into sounds that could travel through ordinary air. And whatever had been sending that signal was now aware that someone had finally learned to hear it. The lights began to converge on the highway, emerging from the forest in greater numbers and moving with increasing urgency. Through my side window, I could see them streaming between the trees like luminous moths drawn to some invisible flame. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming at the edges of my windshield despite the mild October weather. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling my loaded trailer sway slightly as I took the curves faster than recommended. The engine responded with a deeper rumble, but even pushing toward maximum speed, I couldn't seem to outdistance the lights. They flowed alongside my truck like a river of cold fire, their movements becoming more agitated with each passing mile. Then ahead in the distance, I saw salvation in the form of bright fluorescent lighting and the familiar logos of a major truck stop. The sight of that commercial oasis filled me with relief so intense it made my chest tight. I'd never been happier to see the prospect of diesel fuel, overpriced coffee, and the company of other drivers going about their mundane business. As I approached the off-ramp, I gave one final test of my horn almost without thinking. The stuttering pattern echoed across the night air. 3 short, 2 short, 1 long fade. But this time the answering call didn't come from the forest. It came from directly ahead from the truck stop itself, and it was loud enough to rattle my windows. I pulled into the parking area and shut down my engine with shaking hands, Grateful for the harsh fluorescent lights and the normalcy they represented, other trucks sat in neat rows, their drivers presumably sleeping or taking their mandatory rest breaks. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for the thin layer of frost that covered my windshield, and the way my breath continued to form clouds despite being surrounded by the artificial warmth of civilization. I never did get that horn fixed. The next morning, when I tested it before leaving the truck stop, it worked perfectly, producing the clear, strong blast that it was designed to make. The stuttering pattern was gone as if it had never existed at all. But sometimes on foggy nights when I'm driving through remote areas, I still hear that broken rhythm echoing from the darkness beyond my headlights, calling out across impossible distances to announce that something is still out there, still waiting for the right signal to guide it home. The voice that steals time. From Jake Morrison. The rain had been my companion for the better part of 300 miles, drumming its steady rhythm against the windshield of my Peterbilt, as I hauled 18 tons of machinery parts through the Wyoming darkness. The wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic dance, and the CB radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter of drivers fighting sleep and loneliness with stories and small talk. Channel 19 was busy tonight, voices floating through the static like ghosts in the electronic wilderness, each one a lifeline connecting us scattered souls across the endless highways. I'd been running this route between Denver and Seattle for nearly 15 years. Knew every truck stop, every grade, every place where the state troopers like to hide. At 42, I wasn't the youngest driver on the road anymore, but I wasn't ready for the rocking chair either. My hair had started showing gray at the temples, and my back complained more after long hauls. But the road still called to me with its promise of freedom and solitude. Tonight felt different, though. Something in the air that made the familiar stretch of Interstate 80 seem strange and unwelcoming. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. when I first heard her voice. The regular chatter on Channel 19 had died down to almost nothing. Just the occasional check from a driver fighting to stay awake, when suddenly there was this woman's voice clear as crystal, cutting through the static like a blade through silk. She wasn't using any call sign, wasn't identifying her location or direction, just talking in this soft, melodic tone that seemed to wrap around your mind like warm honey. "Anyone out there feeling the weight of time tonight?" she said, and something about the way she phrased it, not really a question, but more of a statement, made me reach for my handset without thinking. The CB had always been my connection to other drivers, a way to share road conditions and warnings, but this voice felt different, personal somehow, like she was speaking directly to me across the miles of darkness. "This is Jake in the eastbound Pete," I responded, my voice sounding rougher than usual in the quiet cab. "Copy you on 19. You sound like you might be having a long night too." The response came immediately, that same honey-smooth voice flowing through my speakers with an intimacy that made me glance around the empty cab, as if she might be sitting right there beside me. "Oh, Jake," she said, and the way she spoke my name sent a strange shiver down my spine. Time is such a peculiar thing, isn't it? Sometimes it crawls like traffic in a construction zone, and sometimes it flies by like mile markers on a downhill grade. "Tell me, Jake, do you ever wish you could slow it down? Maybe even reverse it a little, go back to when things were simpler?" The question caught me off guard because it hit closer to home than a stranger's voice on a CB radio had any right to. I found myself thinking about Sarah, my ex-wife, about the house we'd shared before the road claimed too much of my time and attention. About my dad, who'd passed 3 years ago while I was stuck in a snowstorm in Montana, unable to make it home in time to say goodbye. The regrets had a way of piling up like snow on a mountain pass, each one adding to the weight until something had to give. "I reckon we all got things we'd like to do over," I said into the handset, surprised at how easily the words came. The woman's laugh was like silver bells in a gentle breeze, and when she spoke again, her voice seemed to come from right inside the cab with me, close enough to touch. "What if I told you there was a way, Jake? What if I told you that some frequencies can do more than just carry voices across the miles? Some frequencies can carry you back to the times and places you've lost. Let you live in those moments when the world still made sense. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me safe through millions of miles and countless nights exactly like this one, was telling me to switch channels to find some normal driver talking about weather and road conditions. But her voice had this quality that made everything else seem less important, less real somehow. I realized I'd been driving slower without meaning to, my speed dropping from 70 to 60 to 55, as if my truck itself was being drawn into the strange spell of her words. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windshield, but now it seemed to be keeping time with something deeper, something that reached into my chest and synchronized with my heartbeat. The mile markers were sliding by in slow motion, their reflective numbers catching my headlights like cat's eyes in the darkness. "Change your channel to 27, Jake," she said, and her voice had taken on an urgency that made my hand move toward the channel dial before I'd consciously decided to comply. 27 is where the real conversations happen, where we can talk about the things that matter, the choices we'd make differently if we had the chance. The rational voice in my head was screaming warnings now, telling me that nothing good ever came from abandoning the established protocols of the road, but my fingers were already turning the dial, leaving the familiar territory of Channel 19 for the unknown waters of 27. The static on 27 was different, deeper somehow, with an underlying pulse that seemed to match the rhythm of the rain and the steady thrum of my diesel engine. When her voice came through again, it was even clearer than before, so present and immediate that I found myself checking the passenger seat to make sure I was still alone in the cab. "That's better, Jake. Now we can really talk. Tell me about the biggest mistake you ever made, the one that changed everything." And suddenly I was talking, words pouring out of me like water through a broken dam, telling the stranger about the fight Sarah and I had before she left, about the pride that kept me from calling her back, about all the ways I'd chosen the road over the people who mattered most. With each word I spoke, something strange was happening to the world outside my windshield. The rain was changing, becoming lighter, softer, and the darkness beyond my headlights was taking on a different quality, less harsh and oppressive, more like the gentle darkness of an earlier time. The digital numbers on my dashboard clock were moving differently too, not backward exactly, but slower, as if time itself was becoming negotiable, subject to revision and reconsideration. "You were younger then, Jake," her voice whispered through the speakers, and I could swear I felt phantom fingers touching my face, smoothing away lines that had taken years to etch themselves around my eyes and mouth. "You were 35, still strong and hopeful, still believing that love could overcome anything if you just worked hard enough." And she was right. I could feel it happening, the stiffness leaving my back, the ache departing from my joints, the weight of accumulated years beginning to lift from my shoulders like fog burning off in the morning sun. The highway ahead was changing too, the familiar stretch of Interstate 80 becoming something else entirely, an older road with different markers, different signs, leading to places I'd thought were lost forever. My truck was responding to the transformation as well, the engine note becoming smoother and more powerful, the interior taking on the newness it had possessed when I'd first driven it off the lot all those years ago. But with the changes came a creeping realization that made my blood run cold. Despite the warmth spreading through my rejuvenating body, the woman's voice was different now, older somehow, as if the years she was taking from me were being added to her own voice, aging it like wine in a cellar. Each moment I spent on Channel 27 was costing me something precious, but giving her something she needed, feeding a hunger I was only beginning to understand. "Don't stop now, Jake," she pleaded, and her voice was becoming increasingly desperate, increasingly human. "Tell me more about those early days. Let me feel what it was like when the world was young and full of possibilities." I realized with growing horror that she wasn't just listening to my memories. She was absorbing them, taking the experiences that had made me who I was and adding them to her own diminished existence. The truck was becoming harder to control as the changes accelerated. My hands looking younger and less experienced on the steering wheel, my mind losing the accumulated wisdom of years on the road. The highway ahead was dissolving into uncertainty, the familiar landmarks disappearing into a haze of temporal confusion, where past and present blended into something that belonged to neither time nor place. With tremendous effort, I forced my hand toward the channel dial, fighting against the strange lethargy that was settling over my mind like a comfortable blanket. The woman's voice rose in pitch and desperation as she sensed what I was about to do, begging me to stay, promising me youth eternal if I would just keep talking, keep feeding her insatiable need for borrowed time. "Please don't leave me alone again. Jake," she cried, and in that moment I heard the truth beneath her supernatural hunger, the desperate loneliness of something that existed between the radio waves. The living load, from Marcus Chen the manifest said animal feed, but I should have known better when the pickup location turned out to be a derelict laboratory complex just outside Baton Rouge. The Louisiana humidity hung thick as molasses that August night, and my diesel engine purred steady and low as I backed up to the loading dock of what used to be Meridian Bioscience. The security guard who met me there had nervous eyes that darted everywhere except toward the cargo bay doors, and when he handed me the paperwork, his fingers trembled like autumn leaves. I've been hauling freight for 23 years. Everything from live chickens to military equipment I'm not supposed to ask questions about. But this job felt different from the moment I accepted it. The pay was too good for a simple cross-country haul to Seattle, nearly triple my usual rate, and the client insisted on cash up front. When money talks that loud, though, you tend to listen, especially when your daughter's college tuition is breathing down your neck like a heat-seeking missile. The loading crew worked in complete silence, wheeling out dozens of sealed metal containers about the size of oil drums. Each container bore faded biohazard symbols and shipping labels marked with cryptic codes that meant nothing to me. The workers wore full hazmat suits despite the sweltering heat, their faces hidden behind fogged-up visors that made them look like deep-sea divers exploring some underwater wreck. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing each container with heavy-duty straps and foam padding, but I noticed they handled everything with exaggerated care, as if the slightest jostle might crack open Pandora's box. The head supervisor, a thin man whose voice came out muffled through his respirator, approached my cab as they finished loading. He handed me a temperature monitoring device and explained that the cargo needed to stay below 40 degrees Fahrenheit at all times. The refrigeration unit was already humming like a mechanical lullaby, but he made me promise to call immediately if the temperature rose even a single degree. His eyes held the kind of worry you see in people who know secrets they wish they could forget. By midnight, I was rolling north on Interstate 55, my headlights cutting through the thick Louisiana darkness like twin searchlights. The radio played soft country melodies that mixed with the steady rumble of my engine and the constant whisper of the refrigeration unit keeping my cargo cold. Everything seemed normal for the first few hours. Just another night run through America's sleeping heartland. But somewhere around Jackson, Mississippi, I started noticing the smell. It began as something barely perceptible, a faint organic scent that reminded me of wet earth after a spring rain. At first I thought it might be coming from outside, maybe a paper mill or farm somewhere in the distance, but as the miles rolled by, the smell grew stronger and more distinct. It carried hints of something growing, something alive and vital, like the smell of a greenhouse in full bloom. The odor seemed to seep through the sealed connection between my cab and trailer, which shouldn't have been possible with the refrigeration system running. Near Memphis, I pulled into a truck stop to check my load and grab some coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects as I walked around my trailer, running my hands along the refrigeration unit's control panel. The temperature gauge showed a steady 38 degrees, well within the acceptable range, but the growing smell was undeniable now. It had evolved into something more complex, carrying notes of fresh vegetation mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify, something that made my skin crawl with an inexplicable unease. I climbed up on the loading dock at the back of the truck stop and pressed my ear against the trailer's rear doors. The refrigeration unit's steady hum filled my ears, but underneath that mechanical drone, I could swear I heard something else. It was subtle, almost rhythmic, like the sound of gentle rustling or perhaps very quiet scratching. I told myself it was just the normal settling and shifting that happens with any cargo load, but deep down, something primitive in my brain was sending up warning flares. The coffee tasted like burnt rubber, but I needed the caffeine to keep my eyes open for the long haul ahead. As I sat in the truck stop's harsh neon glow, watching other drivers come and go like ghosts in the night, I called the emergency number the supervisor had given me. The phone rang and rang before connecting to what sounded like an automated answering service. I left a message about the strange smell, but mentioned that the temperature was holding steady, then climbed back into my cab and continued north. Somewhere in Missouri, as dawn began painting the eastern horizon in shades of pale gold, the smell changed again. Now it carried an unmistakably animal musk, rich and earthy like the scent of a barn or stable. My trailer had become a rolling greenhouse, and whatever was growing back there was definitely alive. I could hear it more clearly now through the thin wall that separated my cab from the cargo area. A constant whisper of movement that sounded like thousands of tiny fingers brushing against metal. The temperature gauge still read 38 degrees, but I was beginning to suspect that whoever had loaded my trailer had given me faulty monitoring equipment. I tried calling the emergency number again, but this time it went straight to a disconnected message. The laboratory complex where I'd picked up the cargo was nearly 800 miles behind me, and my delivery deadline was still 18 hours away. I was committed to this run whether I liked it or not. As the sun climbed higher, I started noticing something even more disturbing. Long, thin strands of what looked like coarse brown hair had begun seeping out from the seal around my trailer's rear doors. At first, they were just a few wispy threads dancing in the wind created by my truck's movement. But as the miles passed, the strands grew thicker and more numerous. They whipped and fluttered behind my trailer like the tail of some massive animal, leaving a trail of organic debris scattered across the interstate. By afternoon, the hair had grown long enough to drag on the pavement behind my truck. I could see it in my side mirrors, a dark stream flowing behind me like seaweed in an underwater current. Other drivers began honking and pointing as they passed, their faces twisted with confusion and disgust. The hair continued to lengthen, and I realized with growing horror that it was emerging not just from the rear doors, but from every seal and joint in the trailer's construction. The scratching sounds from inside the trailer had grown louder too, no longer subtle whispers, but distinct scraping noises that suggested something was clawing at the metal walls from within. The smell had evolved into something overwhelming, a mixture of wet animal fur and the rich, loamy scent of soil and growing things. I had to drive with my windows closed despite the heat, but the odor seemed to penetrate everything, clinging to my clothes and filling my nostrils with its organic intensity. Near Kansas City, I pulled into another truck stop and walked around to examine my trailer more closely. The sight that greeted me was like something from a fever dream. Thick ropes of coarse, dark hair now protruded from every possible opening, hanging down like Spanish moss and forming dense mats that dragged on the ground. The hair seemed to have a life of its own, moving and shifting even when there was no wind, writhing like the tentacles of some deep-sea creature. I grabbed a handful of the hair and immediately jerked my hand back. It was warm to the touch, despite the refrigeration unit running at full capacity, and it felt disturbingly organic, not like synthetic fibers, but like actual animal fur. Worse still, as I watched, the strands seemed to be growing longer in real time, extending themselves inch by inch with a purposeful determination that defied natural explanation. The other truckers at the stop gave me a wide berth, staring at my trailer with expressions of disbelief and revulsion. One veteran driver approached me cautiously and asked what the hell I was hauling. When I showed him my manifest listing animal feed, he just shook his head and walked away, muttering something about government experiments and things that shouldn't exist. I tried starting my engine to continue the journey, but the thick mats of hair had begun wrapping around my rear axles and drive shaft. The truck lurched and strained as I put it in gear, the hair providing resistance like I was trying to drive through deep mud. I had to stop and manually pull away handfuls of the stuff, which continued to feel disturbingly warm and seemed to writhe in my grasp like living snakes. As evening approached and I crossed into Colorado, the situation became truly nightmarish. The hair now formed a massive trailing cloud behind my truck, so thick and voluminous that it obscured the vision of drivers behind me. The Colorado State Police pulled me over just outside Denver, and the trooper who approached my cab had his hand resting on his service weapon. He'd never seen anything like my trailer in 20 years of highway patrol, and he strongly suggested I find somewhere to park until I could figure out what was happening with my cargo. I pulled into a remote truck stop in the Colorado mountains, where the thin air and approaching darkness gave everything an otherworldly quality. The highway that remembers, from Marcus Holloway. The thing about driving the same routes for 23 years is that you start to think you know every mile marker, every pothole, every faded yellow line like the back of your weathered hands. Highway 47 through the Nevada desert had been my bread and butter for most of my career. A straight shot of asphalt that stretched between Reno and Las Vegas, like a black ribbon laid across cracked earth. I'd driven it in every kind of weather, at every hour of the day and night, hauling everything from electronics to furniture to the occasional container I didn't ask too many questions about. But that Tuesday night in October, something felt different from the moment I pulled my Peterbilt out of the truck stop just outside Carson City. The air had that crisp bite that comes with the change of seasons, and my breath made small clouds in the cab despite the heater humming steadily. My load was nothing special, just a shipment of restaurant equipment bound for a casino in Henderson. But the dispatcher had been oddly insistent about the timeline. Not rushed, mind you, just specific. Be there by dawn, he'd said, and take the old highway, not the interstate. Fuel efficiency, he'd claimed, though that made little sense for a route I could drive blindfolded. The first hour passed without incident, my truck's diesel engine purring with that familiar rhythm that had lulled me through countless nights. The radio played soft country music, occasionally interrupted by the static crackle of other drivers checking in on the CB. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating the scrub brush and weathered fence posts that marked the boundaries between nothing and more nothing. In the distance, the lights of small towns twinkled like fallen stars, reminders that life persisted even in this vast emptiness. It was somewhere around the halfway point, near a place called Dry Creek that probably hadn't seen actual water in decades, when I first noticed something odd in my mirrors. Not behind me exactly, but about the road itself. The asphalt that I'd just passed over seemed different somehow, though in the red glow of my taillights it was hard to make out details. I adjusted the mirror, thinking maybe it was just the angle, but the image remained unsettling. Where smooth pavement should have been, the surface appeared rough, broken, as if age had suddenly caught up with that particular stretch of highway. I slowed down slightly, not enough to affect my schedule, but just enough to get a better look the next time I glanced back. The mirrors showed more of the same strangeness, sections of road that looked decades older than they had when I'd driven over them moments before. Cracks spiderwebbed across the asphalt, weeds pushed up through gaps that definitely hadn't been there before, and some areas looked almost crumbled away entirely. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, the way shadows and darkness could play games with your eyes after hours of staring at an empty road. But as the miles accumulated beneath my wheels, the phenomenon became more pronounced and impossible to dismiss. I started paying closer attention to the road ahead, noting landmarks and the condition of the pavement as I approached them. A section with a fresh patch job would look perfectly normal in my headlights, solid and well maintained. But when I checked my mirrors after passing, It appeared weathered and cracked, sometimes barely passable. It was as if my truck was aging the highway somehow, or perhaps revealing its true state beneath some kind of illusion. The radio began to act strangely around this time, the music fading in and out like a weak signal, though I'd never had reception problems on this route before. The CB radio was worse, filled with static and what sounded almost like voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. I tried reaching out to other drivers, but my calls went unanswered, lost in the white noise that seemed to grow stronger with each passing mile. Even more unsettling, I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. Unusual for a highway that typically saw steady traffic even in the early morning hours. The temperature gauge on my dashboard began fluctuating erratically, jumping between normal operating range and dangerously high. Though the engine sounded fine and there were no warning lights, my fuel gauge seemed to be dropping faster than it should, though I couldn't hear any change in the engine's rhythm or feel any loss of power. It was as if the truck itself was being affected by whatever was happening to the road, aging or deteriorating in subtle ways that didn't quite make sense but were impossible to ignore. When I reached the town of Silver Springs, a small community that usually showed signs of life even at this hour, I found the streetlights dim and flickering, casting weak yellow pools on empty sidewalks. The buildings looked older than I remembered, paint peeling and windows dark not with sleep but with abandonment. I considered stopping, maybe finding someone to talk to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But something about the place felt wrong, hollow, like a movie set designed to look lived in but lacking any actual inhabitants. I pressed on, increasingly desperate to reach my destination, but the road ahead was becoming as problematic as what lay behind. Sections of highway that should have been smooth and modern appeared weathered and patched, with barriers and warning signs that I was certain hadn't been there on my last trip through just 2 weeks earlier. Construction zones materialized in my headlights, complete with orange cones and reduced speed limit signs, but they felt temporary and insubstantial, as if they existed only for the brief moment I was passing through them. The most terrifying realization came when I tried to change course, to take an exit ramp that I knew would lead to a truck stop, where I could gather my thoughts and maybe find another driver to confirm what I was experiencing. The exit appeared normal as I approached, well lit and clearly marked. But as I began to decelerate and move toward the off-ramp, I watched in my mirrors as the road behind me didn't just age but actually began to crumble and fall away. Chunks of asphalt tumbling into darkness like the highway was dissolving in my wake. Panic set in then, a cold fear that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. I accelerated back onto the main highway, afraid to take any exit, afraid to stop, afraid that whatever was causing the road to deteriorate behind me might catch up if I slowed down too much. The speedometer climbed higher than I was comfortable with for this load, but the alternative seemed far worse. In my mirrors, I could see that the destruction was following at a consistent distance, always there but not gaining ground as long as I maintained my speed. The fuel gauge continued to drop at an alarming rate, and I began to calculate whether I could reach Las Vegas before running empty. The math was close, too close, and I found myself caught between the need to conserve fuel and the fear of what might happen if I slowed down. The radio static had evolved into something that almost sounded like voices calling my name, though that could have been exhaustion and stress playing tricks on my mind. The CB radio occasionally crackled with what sounded like other truckers discussing routes and loads, but when I tried to respond, my voice seemed to disappear into the static without acknowledgement. Dawn began to break as I finally saw the lights of Las Vegas growing larger on the horizon, that familiar glow that had welcomed me at the end of countless runs. But even as relief started to wash over me, I noticed that the city looked different somehow, older and smaller than it should have been, as if I were seeing it from a different time. The skyline was wrong, missing buildings that should have been there, showing others that I thought had been demolished years ago. I managed to reach the delivery address just as my fuel gauge hit empty, the truck coughing and sputtering as I pulled into the loading dock of what should have been a modern casino, but appeared to be an older, shabbier version of what I remembered. The workers who came out to unload my trailer moved with an odd mechanical precision, and when I tried to engage them in conversation, they responded with nods and gestures, but no actual words. Their faces seemed somehow indistinct, as if I was looking at them through fog or water. The paperwork they gave me to sign felt strange beneath my fingers. The paper too thick and the ink too fresh, and when I looked at the date, it showed a day I was certain had already passed. But I signed anyway, desperate to complete the delivery and find some kind of normal explanation for what I'd experienced. They paid me in cash, crisp bills that felt authentic enough, though the serial numbers seemed to repeat in patterns that didn't look quite right. Now I sit in my truck in a parking lot that should be familiar, but feels foreign. Afraid to look too closely at my route map, afraid to plan my trip home. The radio plays music that sounds like songs I know, but with lyrics that are slightly wrong, and the CB radio occasionally brings me conversations from drivers discussing routes that don't exist, and cargo that makes no sense. I've been putting off starting the engine, putting off the moment when I'll have to decide whether to return the way I came or try to find another route home. The breathing walls. From Marcus Chen, the GPS had been acting up for the last 50 miles, its screen flickering between static and impossible directions that led nowhere. I'd been driving my Peterbilt 379 through the winding back roads of northern Montana for nearly 14 hours straight, hauling a load of construction equipment to a mining site that seemed to exist only in theory. The October rain drummed steadily against my windshield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my headlights before sliding away into the darkness. My eyes burned with fatigue, and the familiar ache in my lower back had graduated to a persistent throb that no amount of adjusting my seat could cure. When the rest area appeared through the curtain of rain, it felt like salvation itself. The sign was weathered and partially obscured by overgrown branches, but I could make out the universal symbols for restrooms, parking, and 24-hour availability. The neon light above the entrance flickered intermittently, casting an unsteady blue glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my truck's diesel engine. I'd driven this route dozens of times over the past 5 years, but I couldn't recall ever seeing this particular stop before. Then again, exhaustion had a way of making the familiar seem foreign, and the constant rain reduced visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. I guided my rig into the surprisingly spacious parking area, noting with mild curiosity that the pavement was in pristine condition, despite the remote location. The rest area building sat at the far end of the lot, a low concrete structure that seemed to have been designed sometime in the 70s, all flat angles and narrow windows that reflected my headlights like watching eyes. A few other vehicles were scattered throughout the parking spaces, their shapes indistinct in the rain and darkness. I could make out what looked like a sedan near the building entrance and possibly an RV parked at the far edge of the lot, though the details remained frustratingly vague through the torrential downpour. After backing into a space that gave me a clear view of both the building and the road, I shut down the engine and immediately felt the oppressive silence that followed. The rain continued its relentless percussion on my cab, but beneath that familiar sound I detected something else, something that made me pause with my hand on the door handle. It was a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, though I told myself it was probably just the wind moving through the trees that bordered the rest area. The fluorescent lights inside the building cast long rectangles of harsh white light across the wet pavement, and I could see through the large windows that the interior appeared clean and well-maintained. The dash clock read 2:17 in the morning as I grabbed my jacket and stepped out into the cold mountain air. The rain immediately began soaking through my clothes despite the jacket's water-resistant coating, and I hurried toward the building with my head down against the driving precipitation. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whisper, and I stepped into the blessed warmth and dryness of the rest area's main lobby. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that always reminded me of insect wings, and the air carried the familiar institutional scent of industrial disinfectant, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. something organic and slightly sweet. The interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, stretching back into corridors that seemed to extend further than the building's external dimensions should have allowed. The walls were covered in that ubiquitous government beige paint, broken up by the occasional safety poster or map display. But as I walked deeper into the building, I began to notice something peculiar about the wall panels themselves. They appeared to be slightly curved, creating subtle shadows and optical illusions that made the corridors seem to shift and breathe in my peripheral vision. I attributed this to my exhaustion and the harsh fluorescent lighting, which could play tricks on anyone's eyes after enough hours on the road. The men's restroom was located down a hallway that seemed to curve gently to the left, though I could have sworn I'd been walking in a straight line. Inside, everything appeared normal enough. Clean white tiles and functioning fixtures, though I noticed that the walls here also had that same subtle curvature that made the space feel somehow alive. While washing my hands, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror above the sink, and was startled by how pale and hollow-eyed I looked. The fluorescent light flickered momentarily, and in that brief instant of dimness I could have sworn the wall behind me shifted, the tiles seeming to ripple like water. But when the light steadied, everything appeared perfectly normal. I decided to grab a cup of coffee from the vending area before heading back to my truck, hoping the caffeine would help me push through the remaining hours to my destination. The vending machines were located in an alcove off the main corridor, their mechanical hums adding to the building's ambient soundtrack. As I fed quarters into the coffee machine, I became aware that the breathing sound I'd noticed outside was somehow more pronounced in here. A slow, steady rhythm that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I pressed my ear against the nearest wall panel, telling myself I was just checking for mechanical systems or ventilation equipment, but what I heard made my skin crawl. There was definitely something behind the walls, something that rose and fell with organic regularity. The wall itself felt warm against my cheek, and I could swear I detected a faint pulse, like a heartbeat magnified and slowed down. I stepped back quickly, my coffee forgotten, and stared at the wall with growing unease. The beige paint job looked different now, more textured, and as I watched with increasing alarm, I began to see a pattern of lines running through the surface. Lines that branched and converged like blood vessels or the root system of some enormous plant. The fluorescent lights flickered again, longer this time, and in the unstable illumination, the walls around me began to move with unmistakable purpose. They expanded and contracted rhythmically, and the branching lines beneath the paint pulsed with a dark fluid that was definitely not electrical wiring. The floor beneath my feet felt soft and yielding, and when I looked down I saw that the institutional carpeting had taken on the same organic texture as the walls. I was no longer in a government rest area. I was inside something alive. Something vast and hungry that had disguised itself as a safe haven for weary travelers. Panic flooded my system as I realized that the other vehicles in the parking lot hadn't belonged to travelers at all. They were bait, props in this thing's elaborate deception, left there to make the rest area seem legitimate and inviting. The breathing grew louder and more rapid, as if the creature had sensed my awareness and was becoming excited by the prospect of feeding. The walls began to close in, not quickly, but with the inexorable patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. The corridors that had seemed so spacious just minutes before were now contracting, the ceiling lowering and the walls drawing together like the throat of some impossible beast. I ran toward what I hoped was the exit, but the hallways had changed, branching off in directions that hadn't existed before, leading deeper into the creature's interior, rather than back to safety. The fluorescent lights were failing one by one, replaced by a dim reddish glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My footsteps echoed strangely in the contracting space, and I could feel the floor becoming more uneven and organic with each step. Behind me I heard wet sliding sounds as passages sealed themselves, cutting off any possibility of retreat. The main lobby, when I finally reached it, was almost unrecognizable. The ceiling had dropped to barely 8 feet, and the walls curved inward like the interior of a stomach. The automatic doors were still there, but they now appeared to be made of the same fleshy material as everything else. Their glass surfaces clouded with moisture that looked disturbingly like digestive fluid. I threw myself against the doors, pounding on the yielding surface and screaming for help that I knew would never come. The creature's breathing had become a roar that filled my ears and vibrated through my bones. Just as the walls were about to close completely, something shifted in the creature's rhythm, a momentary relaxation that created a gap in the door mechanism. I squeezed through the opening just as it began to contract again, feeling the fleshy surfaces scrape against my jacket as I fought my way back into the cold, clean air of the Montana night. Behind me, the rest area building returned to its innocent appearance, the fluorescent lights steady and welcoming, the automatic doors closing with their normal mechanical precision. I ran to my truck through the driving rain, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over with its familiar rumble, and I backed out of that parking space faster than I'd ever moved 18 wheels before. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in my mirrors and saw the rest area one last time, looking perfectly normal in the red glow of my taillights. But I knew what I'd experienced, and I knew that somewhere behind those innocent walls, the creature was still breathing. The iron memory. From Jake Winters, the old Peterbilt 359 had been sitting in the estate sale lot for 3 weeks when I first laid eyes on her, and I knew she was something special the moment I heard her story. The seller, an elderly woman with weathered hands and tired eyes, told me the truck had belonged to her great-grandfather, then her grandfather, then her father, passing down through generations like some kind of mechanical heirloom. What caught my attention wasn't just her pristine condition despite being built in 1976, but the way she seemed to hum with something deeper than diesel fuel, something that made the hair on my arm stand up when I ran my palm along her midnight blue paint. The paperwork traced her origins back to a manufacturing plant in Tennessee, but there was something else in those yellowed documents, something the woman mentioned almost as an afterthought while I signed the title transfer. The steel in that particular truck, she said, had come from a special batch, recycled metal from old railroad tracks that had been torn up decades earlier, railroad tracks that had carried supplies and soldiers during the Civil War, she added with a nervous laugh, as if she wasn't quite sure whether to believe the family legend herself. I should have paid more attention to that detail, should have noticed the way her voice trembled slightly when she mentioned those old rails. But I was too focused on the incredible deal I was getting on what appeared to be a perfectly maintained vintage rig. The engine purred like it had just rolled off the assembly line. The chrome gleamed without a spot of rust, and every gauge and switch responded with precision that would make a modern truck jealous. I handed over the cash, shook her weathered hand, and drove away feeling like I'd just won the lottery. The first few weeks of owning her were pure bliss. The kind of driving experience that reminds you why you fell in love with the road in the first place. She handled like a dream, barely sipped fuel despite her age, and drew admiring looks and conversations at every truck stop from Georgia to Montana. Other drivers would walk around her slowly, running their hands along her pristine surfaces, asking questions about her restoration that I couldn't really answer because she seemed to maintain herself. I started calling her Dixie, though I'm not entirely sure why the name came to me so naturally, rolling off my tongue like I'd been saying it for years. It was during my 3rd month with her that I started noticing the peculiarities, small things at first that I dismissed as quirks of an older vehicle. The radio would occasionally pick up what sounded like period music, scratchy melodies that seemed to drift through the speakers even when the power was off. Faint enough that I convinced myself I was imagining them. The air conditioning would sometimes carry scents that didn't belong in a truck cabin. Earthy smells of gunpowder and wood smoke, leather and something metallic that made my chest tighten with unexplained anxiety. But it was the dreams that really started to unnerve me, vivid sequences that would play out behind my closed eyelids during mandatory rest breaks. Scenes of men in blue and gray uniforms moving supplies along railroad tracks that looked eerily familiar. despite being from an era I'd never experienced. In these dreams, I could feel the weight of history pressing down like summer humidity, could sense the desperation and determination of soldiers who knew they were part of something larger than themselves, something that would echo through generations whether they survived or not. The dreams began bleeding into my waking hours during a particularly long haul through Virginia, rolling hills and farmland that seemed to trigger something deep within Dixie's mechanical memory. I'd be cruising along perfectly modern highways when suddenly the landscape would shimmer and shift in my peripheral vision, showing me glimpses of what this same terrain might have looked like a century and a half ago. Wooden fences where modern guardrails should be, dirt paths cutting through fields that were now subdivisions, and always that persistent sensation that I was being watched by eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. The manifestations became stronger as we moved deeper into what had once been Confederate territory, and I began to suspect that whatever memories were stored in Dixie's recycled steel were becoming more active, more insistent about being acknowledged. The radio static would occasionally resolve itself into voices speaking in accents thick with regional dialect, discussing troop movements and supply shortages with the casual familiarity of men who lived with death as a daily companion. Sometimes I could swear I heard the distant sound of cannon fire mixing with the steady rumble of the diesel engine, creating a rhythm that seemed to match my increasingly rapid heartbeat. One evening, while parked at a rest stop near Antietam, I decided to do some research on my laptop, typing in searches about Civil War railroads and recycled steel, following digital breadcrumbs that led me deeper into a rabbit hole of historical documentation. What I found made my blood run cold in ways that the truck's air conditioning never could. The railroad tracks that had supposedly contributed steel to Dixie's construction hadn't just carried supplies during the war. They had been part of a crucial supply line that had seen some of the conflict's most desperate moments. Rails that had carried wounded soldiers, ammunition, and the hopes of a divided nation through some of its darkest hours. More disturbing were the accounts I found of unexplained incidents involving vehicles and machinery made from that same recycled steel. Reports stretching back decades of drivers experiencing visions, hearing voices, and feeling the presence of Civil War soldiers during their travels through historically significant areas. The reports were scattered across obscure forums and local newspaper archives, easy to dismiss individually, but forming a pattern that made my hands shake as I scrolled through page after page of similar experiences. That night, as I tried to sleep in Dixie's cab, the manifestations reached a new intensity that left me questioning my sanity and my safety. The truck began to rock gently, as if we were on a moving train rather than parked on solid asphalt, and through the windshield I could see the rest stop flickering like a badly tuned television, occasionally replaced by images of a Civil War-era railroad depot, complete with uniformed soldiers and horse-drawn supply wagons. The smell of coal smoke filled the cabin so strongly that I had to crack the windows, but the night air outside carried the same acrid scent, as if the very atmosphere around us had been transported back to 1863. Through the speakers came the clearest voices I'd heard yet. Soldiers discussing an urgent supply run that had to reach the front lines before dawn, their words carrying the weight of men who knew that failure meant friends would die for lack of ammunition and medical supplies. I found myself responding to their conversations, offering encouragement and updates on our progress along roads that no longer existed, participating in a mission that had concluded more than a century before I was born but felt more real and immediate than any cargo I'd ever hauled in my actual career. The sensation of being pulled into Dixie's historical memories became so overwhelming that I had to get out of the truck and walk around the dark rest stop, trying to clear my head and reestablish my connection to the present day. But even standing 20 feet away from her, I could still feel the pull of those embedded memories, the recycled steel calling to me with the voices of soldiers who had trusted those rails to carry them safely through a war that had torn the country apart. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't just experiencing random historical echoes, but being drawn into a specific mission that had ended in tragedy, and was somehow still seeking completion through anyone willing to listen. When I climbed back into the cab, determined to drive through the night and put some distance between myself and whatever forces were awakening in Dixie's steel memory, I found that the truck had other plans. The engine turned over smoothly as always, but instead of responding to my input on the accelerator and steering wheel, she began to move according to a route that existed only in the memories of Civil War railroad tracks, following phantom rails through modern landscapes toward a destination that filled me with inexplicable dread. The speedometer showed normal highway speeds, but through the windows I could see we were moving through a historical overlay of the same terrain, past encampments and battlefields that flickered in and out of existence like mirages. I managed to regain control just as we approached what my GPS showed as a perfectly ordinary interstate interchange, but which my eyes insisted was a bombed-out railroad bridge spanning a river that ran red with more than just Virginia clay. With every ounce of strength I possessed, I wrenched the steering wheel toward the modern off-ramp, feeling Dixie's reluctance to abandon her historical mission like a physical weight pressing against my efforts. The truck shuddered and groaned as if torn between two different times, two different purposes, two different drivers separated by more than a century, but united by the mysterious memory, embedded in recycled steel. We came to a stop at a 24-hour truck stop blazing with contemporary neon and fluorescent lights, but even surrounded by modern conveniences and other drivers going about their ordinary business, I could still feel the pull of unfinished Civil War missions flowing through Dixie's frame like electrical current. The weight of memory. From Jake Sullivan, the passenger seat in my Peterbilt 379 had been sinking for 3 weeks now, and I was starting to think it wasn't just worn springs causing the problem. Every morning when I climbed into the cab, that burgundy vinyl seat sat a little lower than it should, like something invisible was settling into it with growing familiarity. The adjustment lever worked fine, cranking it back up to proper height, but by evening it would sag again, the cushion compressed in the exact shape of someone sitting there. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, ever since Sarah died, and in all that time I'd gotten used to the solitude. The empty passenger seat had become a companion of sorts, a place to rest my thermos during breaks or stack my logbooks. But now, watching it slowly sink mile after mile, I felt less alone than I had in years, and that feeling made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't quite explain. The route from Denver to Portland had always been one of my favorites, winding through mountain passes where the air grew thin and the radio stations faded to static. Tonight, a steady drizzle painted silver streaks across my windshield, and the wipers kept a hypnotic rhythm that matched the low rumble of the diesel engine. The dashboard lights cast everything in soft amber, including that passenger seat, which seemed to sink another inch while I wasn't looking. I reached over and ran my hand across the vinyl, feeling for tears or broken mechanisms that might explain the gradual descent. The material was intact, still holding the faint warmth it shouldn't have possessed on this cold October night. My fingers traced the impression left in the cushion, an outline that suggested someone of medium build, maybe 5'6", sitting with perfect posture. Someone exactly Sarah's size. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cab's weather stripping. Sarah had hidden in my passenger seat exactly twice during our marriage, both times surprising me on short regional runs when she could get time off from the hospital. She'd loved watching the countryside roll past, pointing out cloud formations and asking questions about the truck's various gauges and switches. The memory of her voice, bright with curiosity, seemed to echo faintly above the engine's steady drone. As I navigated a particularly sharp curve, the springs in the passenger seat creaked softly, the way they might if someone was shifting their weight to compensate for the truck's movement. I glanced over quickly, half expecting to see a familiar silhouette outlined against the rain-streaked window, but found only shadows and the continuing indentation in the vinyl. The seat had sunk another notch lower, now sitting at roughly the height Sarah would have preferred. She'd always complained that I kept it adjusted too high for her shorter frame, even during those brief rides when she'd joined me. Like sitting on a bar stool, she'd laughed, reaching for the lever to lower it to a more comfortable position. I'd forgotten that detail until now. Forgotten how she'd fidgeted with the height until it felt just right, usually ending up exactly where the seat was now settling on its own. The radio crackled with distant voices, other drivers checking in with their positions and weather reports, but their words seemed muffled and far away. What I heard more clearly was the soft whisper of fabric against vinyl, like someone adjusting their position or smoothing down a skirt. The sound came from the passenger side, barely audible above the rain and engine noise, but distinct enough to make me grip the steering wheel tighter. A semi passed going the opposite direction, its headlights briefly illuminating the cab interior, and in that split second of brightness I could swear I saw the outline of a hand resting on the armrest beside me. Delicate fingers, slightly curved, wearing the thin silver band I'd placed there 17 years ago. But when my vision adjusted back to the dashboard's amber glow, only emptiness remained, along with that persistent indentation growing deeper by the mile. The CB radio suddenly burst to life with a driver's voice, thick with concern and static. "Eastbound Peterbilt near mile marker 247, you got your passenger door secure? Looks like it's rattling pretty good from back here." I grabbed the handset, keying the mic with a thumb that trembled slightly. "Door's secure, driver. Thanks for the heads up." But even as I spoke, I could hear it too, a gentle rhythmic tapping against the passenger side glass, like fingernails drumming impatiently. I pulled into the next rest stop, a lonely stretch of gravel overlooking a valley shrouded in mist and darkness. The truck's air brakes hissed as I set the parking brake, and sudden silence filled the cab. No engine rumble, no road noise, just the soft patter of rain on the roof and something else. Something that sounded disturbingly like quiet breathing coming from the seat beside me. The passenger door handle moved, just slightly, a small downward motion that caught the light from a distant security lamp. I sat frozen, watching as the handle returned to its resting position with the softest click of metal on metal. Then it happened again, a gentle testing motion as if someone outside was trying to get in or someone inside was trying to get out. "Sarah?" The word escaped my lips as barely a whisper, immediately swallowed by the cab's oppressive silence. The passenger seat gave another soft creak, sinking low enough now that anyone sitting in it would be looking up at me rather than straight ahead. The shape pressed into the vinyl had become more defined, showing not just where someone sat but how they sat, legs tucked slightly to one side, shoulders angled toward the driver's seat in an attentive, conversational posture. The handle moved again, more deliberately this time, and I heard the distinct sound of the door's weather stripping compressing slightly, as if someone was leaning against it from inside. But the door remained closed, the windows unbroken, and I was completely alone in a truck cab that felt increasingly crowded with invisible presence. My hand moved toward the ignition, desperate to fill the silence with engine noise and get back on the road. But I stopped when I noticed something that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Fog was forming on the passenger side window, not the random condensation that comes from temperature differences, but deliberate patterns that looked almost like letters being traced by an unseen finger. The shapes were backwards from my perspective, meant to be read from outside the truck, but I could make them out clearly enough. "Miss You" appeared in the foggy glass, followed by "Cold," and then, in careful script that I recognized as distinctly hers, "Home." I fumbled for the door handle, suddenly needing air that didn't carry the faint scent of Sarah's perfume, that soft floral fragrance she'd worn every day we were married. But as my weight shifted toward the driver's door, I felt a gentle pressure on my right wrist, warm fingers wrapping around my arm with familiar tenderness. Not restraining, not frightening, just the soft touch Sarah had used 1,000 times to get my attention. "I know," I whispered to the empty cab, to the presence that felt more real than my own heartbeat. "I know you're cold. I know you want to come home." The pressure on my wrist increased slightly and the passenger seat sank to its lowest possible position. the vinyl compressed as if bearing substantial weight. But I don't know how to take you there. The fog on the window shifted again, forming new letters that spelled out together in that same careful script. The word hung there in the condensation for a long moment before slowly fading, leaving only clear glass and the reflection of my own confused, frightened face. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the passenger seat remaining at its lowest setting despite my attempts to raise it. The adjustment mechanism seemed to be working against me now, fighting every effort to return the seat to its normal height. So I left it where it was, where she wanted it, and drove through the mountain darkness with the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone anymore. The weight in the passenger seat grew heavier as the miles passed, and I found myself talking to it, sharing stories about loads I'd hauled and places I'd seen, filling the cab with conversation the way Sarah and I used to fill our kitchen during late dinners after my runs. Sometimes I could swear I heard responses, soft murmurs of interest or gentle laughter that might have been wind through the cab's vents, but felt like something much more personal. By the time I reached Portland, the passenger seat had sunk so low that the springs were probably compressed completely flat. I completed my delivery and headed toward the return route, but something felt different now, less complete. The presence that had grown so strong during the mountain crossing seemed to be fading, and with each mile eastward, the oppressive weight in the passenger seat grew lighter. Somewhere outside of Baker City, the seat began to rise on its own, slowly returning to its normal height as if invisible weight was lifting away from it. The cartographer's route. From Marcus Chen, the GPS unit had been a gift from my daughter before she left for college, one of those fancy models with the big screen and the voice that sounds almost human. I'd been driving long haul for 23 years, knew every interstate from here to the Pacific like the lines on my palms. But Sarah insisted the technology would make my life easier. What she didn't know, what I never told her, was that I kept a paper atlas tucked behind my seat like a security blanket. Its pages worn soft from years of tracing routes with my finger during mandatory rest stops. The rain had been falling steadily since Oklahoma City, turning the windshield into a canvas of streaking lights and shadows. My Peterbilt hummed its familiar tune, the diesel engine providing a steady heartbeat against the storm's percussion. The load I was carrying, medical supplies bound for a hospital in Denver, meant I couldn't afford delays, but visibility was dropping fast. The white lines on Interstate 70 seemed to pulse in and out of existence with each sweep of the wipers. That's when the GPS started acting strange. The screen flickered once, twice, then displayed a map I'd never seen before. Instead of the usual highway markers and exit numbers, symbols appeared along the route, dark, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe in the blue glow of the display. I rubbed my eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on me, but the symbols remained. The first one appeared just ahead of my current position, a writhing mass of lines that reminded me of snakes coiled together. As I approached that exact spot on the highway, my chest tightened. The symbol seemed to pulse, and suddenly I could see it. A massive truck accident from years past, twisted metal and scattered cargo, emergency lights painting the asphalt red and blue. But it was more than just seeing it. I could smell the acrid smoke, hear the distant sirens, feel the crushing weight of twisted steel. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left me gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I tried to change the GPS settings, punching buttons with increasingly desperate fingers, but nothing responded. The screen remained locked on this hellish map, and more symbols were appearing ahead. A jagged mountain peak that seemed to drip with shadow. A circle filled with what looked like reaching hands. A twisted tree with branches that formed the shape of a face, mouth open in eternal scream. The rain intensified, and I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in over 30 miles. The radio crackled with static, and even the CB remained ominously quiet. My daughter's voice echoed in my memory. "Dad, this GPS has everything. even psychological profiling to optimize your route based on stress levels and personal preferences. At the time, I'd laughed it off as marketing nonsense. Now, those words carried a chill that ran deeper than the storm outside. The next symbol on the map was approaching fast, and this one made my blood freeze. It looked like a small figure, arms outstretched, falling. Sarah. The shape was unmistakably the silhouette of a child, and as I drew nearer to its position on the highway, the familiar tightness returned to my chest, accompanied by a memory I'd buried for decades. She'd been 5 years old, fascinated by my big rig parked in our driveway. I was checking the trailer hitch, making sure everything was secure for the next day's haul, when I heard her little shoes pattering on the concrete. "Daddy, can I help?" she'd asked, those bright eyes full of trust and innocence. I turned away for just a moment to grab my clipboard, and when I looked back, she was climbing up onto the trailer's edge, trying to reach something she'd dropped. The image on the GPS pulsed brighter, and suddenly I was there again, watching, in slow motion as her small body lost its balance, arms windmilling in the air. I'd caught her, of course, lunged forward and scooped her up before she could fall more than a few inches. But for one heart-stopping instant, I'd seen my world ending in a single moment of inattention. That night, I'd held her close and made myself a promise to always, always be more careful. The memory faded, but the symbol on the GPS remained, now pulsing with a rhythmic heartbeat that matched my own racing pulse. I tried turning the unit off, but it wouldn't respond. Even when I unplugged it from the power source, the screen remained, illuminated, as if drawing energy from some unknown source. More symbols appeared on the route ahead, each one triggering a cascade of recognition and dread. A house with boarded windows, my childhood home after the foreclosure, when Dad lost his job and we had to move in with relatives. A hospital, cross that seemed to bleed darkness. The night Mom passed away while I was 3 states over, unable to make it home in time. A graduation cap with a crack down the middle. Sarah's ceremony that I'd missed because of a breakdown in Nevada. The disappointment in her voice when she called to tell me she'd walked across the stage looking for me in an empty auditorium. The GPS wasn't just showing me a route to Denver. It was mapping every fear, every regret, every moment of failure that had shaped my life. Each symbol corresponded to a real location on the highway where these memories would manifest, where the psychological weight of my choices would become tangible, visible, crushing. I considered pulling over, finding a truck stop and waiting out the storm. But something told me the map would follow me anywhere. This wasn't about the road I was traveling. It was about the road I'd already traveled, the one marked by all, the ways I'd fallen short, all the fears that crept into my thoughts during the long, dark hours between cities. The windshield wipers beat their steady rhythm, and in their sound I began to hear whispers. Sarah's voice asking why Daddy was never home for Christmas morning. My ex-wife Linda explaining to the divorce lawyer that she'd married a ghost, a man who was always somewhere else. My own voice, promising I'd be different, promising I'd change, promising I'd find a way to be the father and husband they deserved. But the promises had been as ephemeral as the white lines disappearing beneath my wheels. The next symbol was larger than the others, positioned exactly where Interstate 70 crossed into Colorado. It looked like a compass rose, but instead of directional points, it had arms reaching in all directions, grasping at nothing. As I approached the state line, the symbol began to spin, faster and faster, until it became a blur of motion on the screen. The temperature inside the cab dropped suddenly, my breath misting in the air despite the heater running full blast. The engine's steady rhythm began to stutter, missing beats like a heart under stress. In the distance, I could see lights that didn't belong, not the familiar glow of truck stops or gas stations, but something older, more primal. They danced just off the highway, beckoning. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the Peterbilt beyond safe speeds for these conditions, but the lights seemed to keep pace with me. The GPS screen now showed my truck as a tiny dot surrounded by symbols, as if I were trapped in the center of a web made from my own fears and failures. The radio suddenly crackled to life, Sarah's voice emerging from the static. "Dad? Dad, where are you? I need you." But she was 22 now, away at graduate school, hadn't called me Dad instead of father in years. Still, the voice was unmistakably hers, young and frightened and reaching across impossible distances. I grabbed the CB microphone with shaking hands. "Sarah? Sarah, I'm here, baby. Tell me where you are." But the only response was laughter. Not Sarah's innocent giggle, but something darker, older, filled with knowledge of every wrong turn I'd ever made. The GPS screen flickered once more, and all the symbols began moving, sliding along the route like living things, converging on my position. I took the next exit without thinking, tires squealing on wet asphalt as I fought to control the truck's momentum. Behind me, the highway seemed to shimmer and fade, as if it had never existed at all. The GPS screen went dark for a moment, then displayed a simple message: recalculating route. When the new map appeared, it showed surface streets leading back to the interstate, a clean route with no symbols, no fears made manifest. But in the bottom corner of the screen, barely visible, new icons were already beginning to form. The map had learned something about me during our encounter, had tasted my deepest anxieties, and found them nourishing. I pulled into an all-night diner, hands still trembling as I turned off the engine. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over empty booths and cold coffee, but it felt safer than the darkness outside. The GPS screen had returned to normal, showing my location with mundane precision. But I knew it was waiting, patient and hungry, mapping the geography of my soul one fear at a time.